The defiance that shook London. A woman dares to speak truth to power in a room where silence is survival. What happens next will change everything. Stay until the end to see how one moment of courage destroys and rebuilds an empire. Hit like and drop a comment with your city. The chandeliers burn too bright. That was Elena Viramont's first thought as she stepped into the Ashford ballroom, her emerald gown trailing behind her like a battle standard she hadn't meant to carry. She should have stayed home. The air tasted of champagne and expensive lies, the kind that coated your throat and made you forget what truth felt like. 300 of London's finest crowded the marble floors, lords and ladies whose titles stretched back centuries, whose wealth could buy kingdoms, whose word could ruin lives before breakfast. And somewhere in this glittering swarm of silk and judgment stood the man she'd come to confront. Duke Adrian Blackthorne. Even his name felt sharp in her mouth. She'd heard it whispered in drawing rooms for months now, always with that peculiar mixture of fear and reverence reserved for men who controlled too much. Textile factories across 3 counties, mining operations in the north, shipping contracts that kept half the empire running. A fortune built on efficiency, they said. Blood money, she knew. Elena accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant just to have something to hold. Her hands wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them. Not here. Not in front of these people who could smell weakness like hounds on a fox. Elena, darling. Lady Margaret Ashford materialized beside her, all-practiced smile and calculating eyes. How brave of you to come. After that unfortunate business with the Thornbury engagement, I wasn't sure we'd see you this season. Our Domanschitzen. The words landed like they were meant to. A reminder that Elena existed on the margins of this world, tolerated but never truly accepted. Her father had been a professor, brilliant but poor. Her mother's family had disowned her for marrying beneath her station. When both had died of fever 3 years ago, Elena had been left with a modest inheritance, a sharp mind, and absolutely no protection from society's casual cruelties. I wouldn't miss it, Elena said, her voice steady. Your parties are always so revealing. Lady Ashford's smile tightened. She understood the double meaning but couldn't quite catch Elena on it. Well, do enjoy yourself, though perhaps avoid the West Gallery. The Duchess of Pembroke is holding court there, and after your editorial in that dreadful Reform newsletter. She drifted away, leaving the threat hanging in the perfumed air. Elena moved through the crowd like a stone through water, present but separate. Noticed but not acknowledged. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed. Sold the estate in Sussex, can you imagine? Her daughter's debut was an absolute disaster. Blackthorne's profits are up another 20%. The man's a genius. That last one stopped her. She turned toward the voice and found a cluster of men near the terrace doors, cigars in hand, congratulating themselves on investments and inheritances. At the center stood a woman in diamonds worth more than Elena's entire inheritance, laughing at something one of them had said. The Duke simply knows how to extract value, the woman said. That's what separates visionaries from sentimentalists. He doesn't let emotion cloud business. Quite right, one of the men agreed. Those northern factories of his run like clockwork now. Cut costs by nearly 40% in 2 years. Elena's fingers tightened on her champagne glass. She knew exactly how he'd cut those costs. For the past 6 months, she'd been volunteering at St. Catherine's Mission in Whitechapel, bringing food and medicine to families. The glittering people in this room would never see. Children with fingers mangled by machinery. Women coughing blood into handkerchiefs from air thick with cotton dust. Men broken by hours no human body was meant to endure. And when she'd asked where they worked, the answer kept coming back the same. Blackthorne Industries. She'd written about it under a pseudonym in the Workers' Defense Quarterly, a small reform publication no one at this party would ever read. She'd thought words might be enough. She'd been wrong. Miss Viremont. The voice came from behind her, deep and edged with something that might have been amusement. She turned and found herself looking at a man whose appearance didn't match the monster she'd built in her mind. Lord Garrett Thorne stood a respectable distance away, his expression polite, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. She knew him vaguely, a younger son of minor nobility, educated on the continent, involved in some kind of import business that didn't require getting his hands dirty. Lord Thorne, I wanted to warn you. He stepped closer, dropping his voice. The Duke arrived 10 minutes ago. He's in the East Salon with the Chancellor. If you're planning anything unwise, perhaps reconsider. What makes you think I'm planning anything? His smile was brief and knowing. You're here. That's planning enough. Everyone knows you've been agitating for factory reforms, and everyone knows whose factories you're targeting. I'm targeting exploitation, Elena said quietly. If the Duke takes that personally, perhaps he should examine why. He'll destroy you. Garrett said it matter-of-factly, like commenting on the weather. Not because you're wrong, because you've made him look bad in front of people whose opinions he values. Men like Blackthorne don't forgive that. Then perhaps it's time someone stopped asking for forgiveness. Garrett studied her for a long moment. You're either very brave or very foolish. I genuinely can't tell which. Does it matter? Probably not. Not to you. He glanced toward the East Salon. But for what it's worth, I hope you know what you're doing. He left her there, alone again, in the crowd. Elena drained her champagne and set the empty glass on a passing tray. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind felt clear, sharp. She'd come here with a plan that had seemed bold in the safety of her townhouse and utterly mad now that she stood in this room full of power and privilege. Confront him, publicly, force him to acknowledge what he'd done. It was social suicide, of course. She'd be ruined before midnight, her name worthless, her already precarious position in society obliterated. No invitations, no prospects, no future in London. But those children in Whitechapel had no future either, and at least she had a choice. Elena smoothed her gloves and moved toward the East Salon. The crowd seemed to thicken as she approached, as if the room itself was trying to stop her. She pushed through anyway, driven by something that felt less like courage and more like the momentum of a fall. You can't stop once it starts. The doors to the salon stood open. Inside, perhaps 50 people gathered in careful clusters, their positions in the room reflecting their positions in the world. The powerful at the center, the less important radiating outward in concentric circles of declining relevance. And at the very center, in conversation with the Lord Chancellor and two men Elena didn't recognize, stood Duke Adrian Blackthorne. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. His evening clothes fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of excellent tailors and absolute certainty in his own position. He held a glass of whiskey but hadn't touched it, a prop, not a pleasure. Everything about him radiated control. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the way he looked up the moment she entered the room, as if he'd been waiting. Their eyes met across 30 feet of polished floor and expensive silence. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, neither of them moved. Then Elena walked forward. The conversations around her faltered and died. She felt the weight of attention shifting, focusing, sharpening into something dangerous. Someone near the door whispered her name. Someone else laughed, nervous and uncertain. She stopped 6 feet from the Duke, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to avoid seeming hysterical. Your Grace. Her voice came out steady. That felt like a miracle. I wonder if I might have a word. The Lord Chancellor frowned. One of the other men looked genuinely alarmed, but Blackthorne's expression didn't change at all. He just looked at her with eyes the color of winter storms and waited. This is hardly the place, the Chancellor began. It's exactly the place, Elena said, still looking at the Duke. Because this is where people speak comfortable lies and ignore uncomfortable truths. I'd like to try something different. Miss Viremont. Blackthorne's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. We haven't been introduced. No, but I know your work. She paused. I've seen what it costs. The room had gone absolutely silent now. Elena could feel them watching, hungry for scandal but terrified of being associated with it. This was the moment. The cliff edge. She could still step back, apologize, retreat into obscurity. Instead, she stepped forward. Your northern factories employ children as young as 7, she said clearly. They work 14-hour shifts breathing air that destroys their lungs. Your foremen use fines and threats to keep them there. Last month, a girl named Sarah Matthews lost 3 fingers to a cotton gin. She was 9 years old. Your company paid her family £5 and told them to be grateful. The silence shifted into something electric. You don't know, one of the men beside Blackthorn started. I know exactly, Elena cut him off. Because I've been there. I've spoken to the families. I've seen the children with mangled hands and chronic coughs and eyes that look 40 years older than their faces. And I've traced every single factory back to one name. Yours. Blackthorn still hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just watched her with an intensity that felt almost physical. You stand here in diamonds and silk, Elena continued, her voice rising despite herself, celebrating profits built on broken children. You toast efficiency that's measured in suffering. That's quite enough. Lady Ashford's voice cracked across the room. She pushed through the crowd, her face pale with fury. Miss Viremont, you will leave immediately, or I will have you removed. Let her finish. Blackthorn spoke quietly, but everyone heard it. Please. Lady Ashford froze, caught between outrage and obedience to a duke. Elena felt the shift in the room, confusion, fascination, the terrible thrill of watching something break that wasn't supposed to. She looked at Blackthorn and found him still watching her with that unsettling focus. I don't have much more to say, she said. Except this, what you're doing is legal, but legality isn't the same as morality, and history will judge you not by your profits, but by the price other people paid for them. That's all. She meant to leave then, to turn and walk out with whatever dignity she had left, but Blackthorn spoke before she could move. You're wrong. 2 words, delivered without heat or defense, just statement. Which part? Elena challenged. The part where you assume I'm unaware. He set down his untouched whiskey with deliberate care. I know exactly what happens in those factories. Miss Viremont. I've been known for 2 years, and I've spent those 2 years systematically changing it. The room released a collective breath. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, suddenly uncertain. What? New safety regulations across all facilities. Minimum age requirement raised to 12 with mandatory education provisions, reduced hours, improved ventilation, independent inspections quarterly. He spoke calmly, listing facts. The board of directors fought me on every single change. I forced it through anyway. The costs you mentioned, the ones I cut by 40%, those were administrative bloat and supply chain inefficiencies, not wages. Elena stared at him. You're lying. I rarely bother with lies. They're inefficient. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to read. Your editorial in the Workers' Defense Quarterly was factually accurate about conditions as they existed, but it's 3 months out of date. I suggest you visit the factories again before making accusations in public. Her mind scrambled for footing. Then why haven't you publicized these changes? Why let people think, because I don't require public approval for private decisions? His voice hardened slightly. And because reform implemented for applause is worth less than reform implemented, because it's correct. I don't need recognition, Miss Viremont. I need safer factories. I have them. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Shock, disbelief, excited speculation about what this meant for industry standards, for investment returns, for social positioning. Elena heard none of it clearly. Her ears rang with the sound of her own certainty shattering. If he was telling the truth, and something in his absolute composure suggested he was, then she just publicly humiliated herself based on outdated information. If he was telling the truth, she was the fool here, not him. She started, then stopped. What could she possibly say? Apologize? Double down? Run? Blackthorn stepped closer. Not threatening, just present. The crowd fell silent again, watching. You were right about one thing, he said quietly, meant only for her. Legality isn't morality. I learned that the hard way. Your accusation was outdated, but the principle behind it was sound. That takes courage. Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. I should have verified. Yes, you should have. No mercy in his voice, but no cruelty either, just truth. But most people in this room wouldn't have cared even if the accusations were current. They would have dismissed you for being emotional, hysterical, inappropriate. You spoke anyway. That's, he paused, something shifting in his expression, unusual. Elena couldn't read his tone, couldn't tell if he was mocking her or evaluating her or simply stating facts. I apologize, she said stiffly, for the accusation, not for the principle. I wouldn't expect you to apologize for principle. He studied her face like he was solving an equation. Miss Weiermont, when you verify the current conditions at my facilities, and I suspect you will, I'd be interested in your assessment. My reforms are implemented, but implementation and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. An outside perspective might be valuable. It took her a moment to understand what he was offering. You want me to inspect your factories? I want someone who cares about the outcome more than the optics to tell me if I've actually solved the problem or just made it look better. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, offering it to her. My secretary's information. If you decide you're interested in truth over theater, contact him. He'll arrange access. Elena took the card automatically, her mind still catching up. Blackthorne nodded once, to her, not to the room, and turned back to his conversation with the Chancellor as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just turned her dramatic confrontation into something else entirely. The crowd began to move again, conversations resuming at higher volume, excitement feeding on scandal and surprise. But the tone had shifted. Where before they'd been ready to tear Elena apart for her presumption, now they were uncertain, confused. The Duke had defended his reforms, had acknowledged her principle while correcting her facts, had offered her access instead of destruction. She'd expected battle. He'd given her complication. Lady Ashford appeared at her elbow, face tight with controlled fury. You will leave, now. Elena looked at the card in her hand. Expensive stock, simple engraving, Blackthorne Industries, Daniel Morrison, private secretary, an address in Mayfair. Yes, she said quietly. I think I will. She walked out of the salon, through the ballroom, past the chandeliers that still burned too bright. Behind her, she heard the whispers beginning. Speculation about what had just happened, about what it meant, about whether the Duke was soft or strategic, or something else entirely. She didn't care. Her hands were shaking now, delayed reaction setting in. She'd gambled everything on that confrontation, and somehow walked away with, what? Not vindication, not destruction. Something in between that she didn't have words for yet. Outside, the London night air hit her like cold water. She stood on the steps and breathed it in, trying to steady herself. That was spectacular. She turned to find Lord Garrett Thorne leaning against a column, smoking a cigarette with the air of someone who'd been there a while. Spectacularly stupid, you mean? Maybe. He exhaled smoke toward the stars. But I've been attending these parties for 10 years, and that was the first time I've ever seen anyone actually tell the truth in one. Even if the facts were wrong, the truth was right. If that makes sense. It doesn't. No, I suppose it wouldn't. He stubbed out the cigarette. For what it's worth, I believe him. About the reforms. Blackthorne doesn't lie because he doesn't need to. When you're that powerful, you can just say what you want and make it reality. Elena looked back at the glowing windows of Ashford House. Then why hasn't he told anyone? Made it public? Because he doesn't trust people who need to be seen doing good. Garrett pushed away from the column. He trusts results, and apparently, he gestured at the card still in Elena's hand. He's decided you might be capable of verifying them. That's either a compliment or a test, possibly both. What if I refuse? Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you were right to accuse him or right to doubt yourself. Either way, he wins. Garrett smiled without humor. Blackthorne's good at that, arranging situations where every choice confirms his worldview. It's infuriating, actually. You sound like you know him well. Well enough to know you should take the offer, and well enough to know that doing so will complicate your life in ways you can't predict. He started down the steps, then paused. One more thing, Miss Weiermont. That room full of people, they'll have forgotten your speech by morning, but they won't forget that Blackthorne engaged with you, that he took you seriously. That matters in this world, even if you wish it didn't. Use it or reject it, but don't pretend it's nothing. He disappeared into the darkness between street lamps, leaving Elena alone with a card in her hand and a choice she hadn't expected to face. Behind her, music drifted from the ballroom, a waltz, elegant and empty. The party would go on for hours yet. They'd drink and dance and gossip, and by tomorrow her confrontation would be a story they told at dinner parties, refined and reshaped until it barely resembled what had actually happened. But the card in her hand was real. The children in Whitechapel were real. And Duke Adrian Blackthorne, whatever else he was, had looked her in the eye and offered her a chance to verify the truth for herself. Elena walked down the steps into the London night, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow, to what she would do with an offer that felt simultaneously like an opportunity and a trap. She didn't notice the figure watching from a third-floor window, didn't see the way Duke Blackthorne stood in shadow, tracking her departure with eyes that hadn't looked that alive in 3 years. Not since the accident that killed his wife. Not since he'd stopped believing anything could surprise him. But this woman, with her outdated information and absolute conviction, had done exactly that. She'd walked into a room designed to destroy her and spoken truth anyway. Wrong truth, but truth spoken from principle rather than calculation. He couldn't remember the last time he'd met someone who operated that way. Couldn't remember the last time anything had felt worth his attention. Adrian touched the window glass, cold beneath his fingers, and watched Elena Viermont disappear into the darkness of Mayfair. The Lord Chancellor was waiting downstairs to discuss trade agreements. The board would need briefing on this evening's incident before it spread too far. His schedule for tomorrow was already full. Meetings, decisions, the endless machinery of empire that required his constant attention. But for the first time in 3 years, he found himself interested in something outside that machinery. Someone, rather. Dangerous, he said quietly to his reflection, and foolish. He wasn't sure if he meant Elena's accusation or his own reaction to it. Both, probably. Adrian turned away from the window and went back to the party, where people smiled at him and feared him and never, ever told him the truth, unless it served their interests. He'd gotten used to it, learned to navigate it, built an empire on understanding exactly how transactional every relationship was. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded uncomfortably like his dead wife's whispered, "You're bored, Adrian. Admit it. You've been bored for years. And that girl just made you pay attention." He dismissed the thought. He had work to do, an empire to run, reforms to implement that would save lives regardless of whether anyone acknowledged them. But 3 days later, when his secretary Daniel Morrison informed him that Miss Elena Viermont had contacted them requesting a factory tour, Adrian found himself smiling for the first time since the funeral. "Schedule it personally," he said. "I'll conduct the tour myself. Your Grace, your calendar, clear it. Whatever needs to move, move it." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too well trained to comment. "Of course, sir. When would you like to—" "Tomorrow. The Manchester facility. Make arrangements." After Daniel left, Adrian returned to the contracts on his desk. Trade agreements with India, new shipping routes through Egypt, expansion proposals for the textile mills. The work that had consumed him for 3 years, but his mind kept drifting to emerald silk and fearless eyes and a voice that had shaken a room built on silence. Dangerous, he thought again. But this time, he almost smiled. "What?" The letter arrived at Elena's townhouse the next morning. "Miss Viermont, the Duke has arranged a comprehensive tour of our Manchester facility for Friday next at 10 a.m. Transport will be provided. If this timing is inconvenient, please advise of your preferred alternative. Please be aware that factory conditions, while significantly improved, remain industrial in nature. Appropriate attire is advised. D. Morrison, Private Secretary to the Duke of Blackthorne." Elena read it 3 times, looking for the trap, the mockery, the subtle insult. She found only efficiency. "You're not actually going," said Catherine Hartley, her closest friend, who'd come for tea and found Elena staring at business correspondence instead. "Tell me you're not actually going. I have to verify." "He's a duke, Elena. He can make whatever claims he wants and no one will question them. This is about embarrassing you, proving you wrong publicly. Then let him try." Elena set down the letter. "If he's lying, I'll know. And if he's not—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. "If he's not lying, then I was wrong." And he had every right to destroy me for it, but instead offered me truth. That was the part that kept her awake at night. Not the public humiliation, that she could have survived, but the possibility that she'd misjudged him entirely, that her righteous anger had been built on outdated facts and assumptions, that she'd been so sure she was right that she hadn't bothered to verify. It was a mistake she wouldn't make twice. "I'm going," Elena said firmly, "and when I come back, I'll know the truth, one way or another." Catherine sighed. "Then I'm coming with you. Someone needs to make sure you don't end up trapped in some awful arrangement with a man who probably collects mistakes like other people collect stamps." Elena almost laughed. "He doesn't strike me as the collecting type. No, he strikes me as the calculating type, which is worse." Catherine poured herself more tea with the air of someone settling in for siege. "Fine. We go to Manchester. We inspect his factories. We confirm he's either a reformer or a liar. And then we leave and never think about Duke Adrian Blackthorne again. Agreed?" "Agreed," Elena said. But even as she said it, she wondered why it felt like a lie. The train to Manchester smelled like coal smoke and other people's lunches. Elena pressed her forehead against the window, watching London dissolve into countryside that looked tired even in spring. Across from her, Catherine dozed with her head against the compartment wall, one hand clutching her reticule like someone might steal it in her sleep. Elena envied her the rest. She'd been awake most of the night, her mind circling the same questions. What if he was telling the truth? What if he wasn't? What if the truth was somewhere in the complicated middle, where good intentions tangled with bad outcomes and nothing was as simple as she'd wanted it to be? The letter sat in her pocket, creased from folding and unfolding. Transport will be provided. She'd declined, of course. Arriving in the Duke's carriage would make her look bought before she'd even seen the factories. Catherine had agreed, loudly, and insisted on paying for their tickets herself. "You can't owe him anything," she'd said. "Not money, not favors, not even gratitude. You go as an independent observer, or you don't go at all." Sound advice. Elena just wished it made her feel less like she was walking into a trap she couldn't see yet. The countryside gave way to towns, then industrial sprawl. Factories rose like iron forests, their chimneys pumping smoke into a sky that had forgotten what blue looked like. She'd been to Manchester once before, 5 years ago with her father. He'd called it the future. She'd called it hell with better plumbing. Catherine woke as the train slowed, blinking at the soot-stained buildings outside. "Christ, it's worse than I remembered." "Language," Elena said automatically. "Accuracy," Catherine corrected. She straightened her hat, checking her reflection in the dark window. "Right. We inspect, we document, we leave. 3 hours maximum. If he tries anything, he won't." "You don't know that." Elena didn't, but something about the way Blackthorne had looked at her in that ballroom, clinical, evaluating, completely absent of the leering interest she'd learned to navigate in other men, suggested his interest was intellectual, not predatory, which was either reassuring or more dangerous. She hadn't decided which. The Manchester station was chaos. Workers streamed off trains, heading to shifts that would grind them down and spit them out 12 hours later. Children wove between adults selling newspapers and flowers and things Elena didn't want to identify. The air tasted like metal and desperation. "Lovely," Catherine muttered. "Remind me why we left London?" "Principle." "Right, that thing that keeps you fed and housed." Catherine grabbed Elena's elbow, steering her through the crowd. "Where are we meeting his secretary? Please tell me it's not in some alley where no one will hear us scream." "The Grand Hotel. Respectable enough for you?" "Barely." The Grand Hotel occupied a corner 2 blocks from the station, its facade slightly less grim than its neighbors. Inside, the lobby tried for elegance and achieved functional, clean floors, decent furniture, staff who looked awake. A man in his 30s stood near the entrance, checking his pocket watch with the precision of someone for whom time was currency. He looked up as they approached. "Miss Viremont?" "Mr. Morrison, I assume." Daniel Morrison had the kind of face that gave nothing away. Pleasant, professional, completely unreadable. He acknowledged Catherine with a nod that suggested he'd expected her presence and didn't care either way. "The carriage is waiting," he said. "The factory is a 20-minute drive. His Grace arrived an hour ago to ensure everything was prepared for your inspection. Elena's stomach tightened. He's there? Now? He conducts the tour personally. Morrison's expression didn't change. He was quite specific about that. Catherine and Elena exchanged looks. This wasn't what they'd expected. A secretary's tour, maybe. A foreman's walkthrough with carefully staged scenes. But the Duke himself, waiting at a factory in Manchester when he could have sent anyone? Why, Ace? Elena asked. I couldn't say, miss. Morrison held the door open. But His Grace rarely does anything without reason. The carriage was mercifully unmarked. No ducal crest, no obvious wealth. Just a well-maintained vehicle that blended into Manchester's industrial landscape. Morrison sat opposite them, silent as they rattled over cobblestones toward the factory district. Elena watched the streets change. Residential areas gave way to warehouses, then to blocks of identical brick buildings that could have been prisons or schools or factories. Probably all three, at different hours. Women walked with that particular hunched gait of people who'd stopped expecting the ground to be level. Men gathered on corners despite the cold, their faces carrying the blank look of unemployment stretching toward forever. How many factories does Blackthorne own in Manchester? Catherine asked Morrison. 3 textile mills, 1 processing facility, and a warehouse complex. Today you'll see the primary mill. It employs approximately 800 workers. 800 lives dependent on one man's decisions. The number sat heavy in Elena's chest. The carriage stopped in front of a building that looked like all the others. Brick, tall windows, chimneys. But the yard outside was different, cleaner. The windows showed actual glass instead of boards, and the workers streaming in and out moved with purpose rather than defeat. Morrison opened the door. This way, please. The noise hit first. Even outside, Elena could hear the machines, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. She'd heard it before in Whitechapel, in the small workshops where families worked themselves to death for wages that barely covered bread. But this was different. Louder, more organized, the sound of industry at scale. Morrison led them through a side entrance marked administrative. Inside, the noise faded to a manageable roar. The hallway was clean, not spotless, but maintained. Gas lamps actually worked. The floor showed signs of regular sweeping, small things. But Elena had been in enough factories to know small things mattered. Miss Veermont. She turned and found Duke Adrian Blackthorne emerging from an office, dressed so differently from the ballroom that she almost didn't recognize him. No evening clothes, no aristocratic polish, just dark trousers, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a leather apron that had seen actual use. He looked like he belonged here. That was somehow more unsettling than if he'd shown up in full ducal regalia. Your Grace, Elena managed a nod. You didn't need to. Yes, I did. He dismissed Morrison with a glance. Thank you, Daniel. We'll manage from here. Morrison left without argument. Blackthorne turned his attention to Catherine, who was staring at him with undisguised suspicion. Miss Hartley, your presence is welcome. Additional perspectives improve accuracy. He said it like he meant it, which made Catherine frown harder. He looked back at Elena. I assume you've brought paper and pencil? You'll want to take notes. I have. Good. We'll start with the main floor, then move through cutting, dyeing, and packaging. You'll have access to every room, every worker. Ask whatever questions you need. I won't interfere unless safety requires it. Catherine found her voice. Just like that? Complete access? Miss Hartley, if I wanted to hide something, I wouldn't have invited an inspection. Blackthorne pulled 2 sets of ear protection from a drawer. The noise on the main floor exceeds safe levels for extended exposure. These will help. Stay close. The machinery is dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. He handed them the ear protection and walked toward a heavy door marked production floor. Elena and Catherine followed, exchanging glances that said the same thing. This doesn't feel like a trap. That's what worries me. Blackthorne opened the door and sound crashed over them like a physical wave. The main floor stretched longer than Elena had expected. Rows of looms operated by workers whose hands moved with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this 10,000 times. The air was thick with cotton dust, visible in the shafts of light from the high windows. The smell was oil and sweat and something chemical Elena couldn't identify. But the windows were open. Fans mounted in the ceiling moved the air, not enough to eliminate the dust, but enough to keep it from settling like fog. The workers wore masks, simple cloth things, but better than nothing. And the spacing between machines was wider than Elena had seen in other factories, allowing room to move without brushing against dangerous parts. Blackthorne didn't speak, just walked between the rows with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every bolt and gear belonged. Workers glanced at him and nodded. No fear in their faces, just acknowledgement. One woman actually smiled. Elena pulled out her notebook and started writing. Windows functional, ventilation present, masks provided, spacing adequate. She stopped at one loom where a young woman, maybe 16, worked with focused intensity. Blackthorne noticed and stepped aside, giving Elena room to approach. The girl looked up, saw Elena, and immediately went pale. "It's all right," Elena said, raising her voice over the machinery. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to ask about your work." The girl glanced at Blackthorne, who nodded. "Answer honestly, Mary. There won't be consequences." Mary's hands slowed on the loom. "What do you want to know?" "How long have you worked here?" 2 years, miss." "How many hours per day?" 10. Used to be 14, but His Grace changed it last year. She said it matter-of-factly, not like she was performing for an audience. "We get a half hour for lunch now, and 2 breaks." Elena wrote that down. "And the masks? When did those start?" 6 months back. "We have to wear them, or we get sent home. No exceptions." Mary touched the cloth covering her nose and mouth. "My mom worked textiles her whole life. Died coughing blood at 40. I'm 17 and my lungs are still clear. The masks help." Something in Elena's chest tightened. She'd expected lies or coaching, or the careful neutrality of people too afraid to speak, not this straightforward recitation of facts. "If you could change one thing about working here," Elena asked carefully, "what would it be?" Mary thought about it. "The dust? It's better than it was, but it's still bad. Some days my throat's raw by evening, even with the mask." She paused. "But it's honest work for fair wages, and I don't go home wondering if I'll lose a hand tomorrow. That's more than my cousins at the Pemberton Mill can say." Elena thanked her and moved on, stopping randomly at different stations. She asked about hours, wages, safety, treatment by foremen. The answers varied in detail, but aligned in substance. Things had been terrible, then gradually gotten better. The changes had come slowly over 18 months, resisted by management, pushed through anyway. Always the same name attached to the improvements: His Grace. Catherine interviewed workers on the other side of the floor, her skepticism gradually shifting into something more complicated. Elena could see it in the way her friend's frown deepened, not with anger, but with confusion. This didn't match what they'd expected to find. After an hour on the main floor, Blackthorne led them through cutting and dyeing. The conditions were similar: better ventilation than standard, safety equipment provided, hours reduced from crushing to merely exhausting. In dyeing, Elena noticed drainage systems that kept chemical runoff from pooling where workers stood. In cutting, guards on the blades that slowed production but prevented the casual amputations that plagued the industry. Everything she saw confirmed what Mary had said. Things weren't perfect, but they were better. Demonstrably, measurably better. And it made Elena's stomach turn with something that felt uncomfortably like shame. They ended the tour in a room Blackthorne called the Education Annex, a converted storage space where 24 children sat at desks, learning to read. The youngest looked about 8, the oldest maybe 12. A woman in her 50s stood at the front, pointing to words on a chalkboard. She looked up when they entered, nodded at Blackthorne, and continued teaching without interruption. "Company requirement," Blackthorne said quietly. "Any child employed in the facility must attend education sessions 4 hours per week, minimum. Reading, writing, basic mathematics. It's not sufficient, but it's more than they'd receive otherwise." Elena stared at the children bent over their slates, concentrating on letters that would give them options their parents never had. "How many factories require this?" "Mine. As of 6 months ago, all of them." "And the others? The industry?" resistant to the idea. They argue it reduces productivity. Blackthorn's voice stayed level, but Elena heard the edge underneath. They're not wrong, but productivity isn't the only metric that matters. Catherine spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. What changed your mind? About all this? Blackthorn looked at her, then at Elena. For a moment, something passed across his face. Grief, maybe, or memory too sharp to touch. Then it was gone, replaced by that clinical distance. Consequences, he said simply. I saw them clearly for the first time and couldn't pretend I hadn't. He gestured toward the door. There's one more thing I'd like you to see, if you have time. They followed him out a different exit, into a courtyard Elena hadn't noticed from the street. A small garden occupied one corner, actual plants, struggling but alive in Manchester's poisoned air. Benches lined the edges. 2 workers sat there now, eating lunch in the weak sunlight. Break area, Paul, Blackthorn explained. 10 minutes in the morning, 15 in the afternoon, 30 for lunch. Mandatory. We had to enforce it. Workers wouldn't take breaks voluntarily. They were afraid of losing wages. Do they? Elena asked. Lose wages for breaks? No, pay is calculated by hours scheduled, not hours at the machine. It costs more, but exhausted workers make mistakes. Mistakes cause accidents. The efficiency loss from breaks is negligible compared to the reduction in injuries. Everything he said made sense. Cold, calculated sense that treated human beings like machines that needed maintenance but arrived at the right conclusions anyway. Elena didn't know whether to be impressed or disturbed. Your report in the Workers' Defense Quarterly, Blackthorn said abruptly. You documented 43 specific complaints about conditions in my northern facilities. I have them memorized. Would you like to compare your findings today against those complaints? Elena stopped. You read it? 3 times. It was well researched and clearly written, also completely accurate, as of the date you visited. But he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and offered it to her. These are the dates each reform was implemented, cross-reference to your complaints. You'll note most changes occurred after your article, but before you confronted me at the Ashford Ball. Elena unfolded the paper and found a typed list so detailed it must have taken hours to compile. Complaint number 7, inadequate ventilation, addressed by installation of ceiling fans, completed March 1849. Complaint 15, excessive hours, addressed by schedule, reduction to 10 hours daily, phased implementation beginning January 1849. On and on, 43 items matched to 43 solutions. Why didn't you tell anyone? The question came out sharper than Elena intended. Why let people think you were exploiting children when you'd already started fixing it? Because announcing reforms invites scrutiny of motive. If I publicize changes, people assume I did it for reputation rather than necessity. The work becomes performative. Blackthorn took the list back, refolding it with precise creases. I don't need applause, Miss Weiermont. I need functional factories that don't destroy the people operating them. Recognition is irrelevant. But credit is ego. Ego is inefficient. He said it like stating a mathematical proof. You wrote that article because you cared about the outcome, not because you wanted your name in print. You used a pseudonym. Why? Elena opened her mouth and closed it again, because she'd known signing her real name would destroy her credibility before anyone read the content. Because anonymous truth carried more weight than attributed accusation. Because the work mattered more than the credit. Exactly, Blackthorn said, reading her silence. We're not so different in that regard. We're completely different, Elena shot back. You have power. I have principles. They're not the same thing. No, but they can work toward the same end. He checked his pocket watch, a plain thing, functional rather than decorative. It's nearly 2. There's a train back to London at 4 if you'd like to catch it. Or you can stay longer, continue the inspection. Your choice. Catherine grabbed Elena's arm. We should go. We've seen enough. But Elena was staring at Blackthorn, trying to read the expression that wasn't quite there. Why did you really invite me here? This whole tour? You could have sent documentation, photographs, witness statements. Why bring me all the way to Manchester? For the first time since the ballroom, Blackthorn smiled. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it was genuine. Because documentation can be falsified, photographs staged, witnesses coached. But you, he gestured at her notebook, filled with observations in her own hand. You trust your own eyes more than anything someone could tell you. I needed you to see the truth yourself. Otherwise, you'd spend the rest of your life wondering if I'd lied. And now? Now you know. The conditions aren't perfect. They're industrial and dangerous, and I'm not fool enough to pretend otherwise. But they're better, measurably, and they'll continue improving because that's what I've decided matters. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a reassessment happening too fast to control. This man wasn't the villain she'd built in her mind. But he wasn't a hero either. He was something more complicated, someone who'd looked at human suffering and calculated the most efficient way to reduce it, then implemented that calculation without regard for approval or recognition. It should have felt cold. Instead, it felt almost honest. I'll need to verify, she started. Of course. Speak to workers without supervision. Visit the Whitechapel families again. Ask if conditions have improved for those who work here. Check my claims against reality. Blackthorn's voice stayed level. I expect nothing less. When you're satisfied one way or another, I'd appreciate your assessment. In writing, if you're willing. Why would you want that? Because you'll identify problems I've missed. No one inside a system sees all its flaws. They adapt to them instead. You're outside. You'll see what I can't. Catherine made a noise that might have been a laugh or a curse. You're asking her to consult? For free. I'm asking her to tell the truth. If that serves as consultation, I'll pay for it. Blackthorn looked at Elena. Your time has value, Miss Viermont. If you choose to spend it improving working conditions, that value should be compensated. Standard consulting rate is £10 per documented assessment. I'll pay 50. Elena's breath caught. £15 was more than she spent in 3 months. It was also, she realized with a strange mix of frustration and respect, exactly the right offer. Too small to feel like a bribe, too large to dismiss as insulting. I haven't agreed. You will, because you care more about the outcome than your pride. He said it with absolute certainty. Take the 4 o'clock train. Think about what you've seen. When you're ready to provide feedback, contact Daniel. He'll arrange everything. Blackthorn nodded once, that same gesture from the ballroom, acknowledgement without deference, and walked back toward the factory offices. Morrison appeared as if summoned, ready to escort them to the station. Elena stood in the courtyard, notebook in hand, mind racing through everything she'd seen and heard. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackthorn had reformed his factories. The changes were real, documented, verifiable. She'd been wrong to accuse him publicly based on outdated information, but he'd also created the conditions that necessitated reform in the first place. The efficiency that now drove improvements had once driven exploitation. He wasn't innocent. He was reformed. And reformation wasn't the same as absolution. Elena, Catherine's voice was tight. We need to talk, not here. They walked to the station in silence, Morrison trailing at a respectful distance. Elena's mind wouldn't settle. Every certainty she'd carried to Manchester had been challenged, complicated, turned into something that required more thought than she'd anticipated. The train back to London was less crowded. They found an empty compartment and Catherine locked the door before turning on Elena with an expression somewhere between worry and fury. That man is dangerous. He reformed his factories after running them into the ground for years. That doesn't make him a saint, Elena. It makes him adaptable. Catherine sat down hard. And the way he looked at you, he absolutely did. Like you were a problem he wanted to solve. Or worse, Catherine paused, choosing her words, like you were interesting. Men like Blackthorn don't find people interesting. They find them useful or irrelevant. You're neither anymore, and that scares me. Elena sank into the opposite seat. You think he's manipulating me. I think he's playing a game you don't understand yet. All that talk about truth and efficiency and compensation, it sounds reasonable. It probably is reasonable by his logic, but it's also control. Catherine leaned forward. He's offering you exactly what you want: meaningful work, fair pay, the ability to actually improve conditions in a way that ties you to him, to his approval, his projects, his worldview. That's not generosity, that's strategy. Or maybe he actually wants to fix the problems. Maybe he does. That doesn't mean he's safe. Monsieur Catherine's voice softened. I've watched you fight for these reforms for 2 years. I've seen you sacrifice social standing and financial security and any chance of a decent marriage because you believed it mattered. And now this Duke shows up, implements exactly the changes you wanted, and offers you a role in continuing them? It's too perfect, Elena. Perfect things are always traps. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to defend Blackthorn's intentions, or at least the possibility that they might be genuine, but Catherine's words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. She didn't know Blackthorn's motives, didn't understand what game he was playing, if any. All she knew for certain was that his factories had improved, and he wanted her assessment of that improvement. Everything else was speculation built on suspicion. I'll be careful, Elena said finally. That's not the same as declining. No, it's not. Catherine stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. But when this goes wrong, and it will, I'm going to say I told you so at least 40 times. Noted. The train rattled south through the industrial wasteland, carrying them back toward London and decisions Elena wasn't ready to make. She opened her notebook and started writing, documenting everything she'd seen with the precision Blackthorn would probably appreciate and Catherine would probably hate. But precision was all she had right now. Facts instead of feelings, observations instead of conclusions. The truth, recorded carefully, to be examined later when her mind wasn't spinning quite so fast. Outside, Manchester disappeared into distance and smoke. Inside, Elena wrote until her hand cramped, trying to capture something she didn't quite understand yet. The strange feeling that she'd walked into that factory looking for a villain and found something far more complicated instead. A man who'd done terrible things and changed his mind, who now did better things for cold reasons that arrived at warm outcomes, who looked at her like she was a calculation worth solving instead of a woman worth dismissing. Catherine was right, it was dangerous, but Elena had never been particularly good at avoiding danger when principle demanded she walk toward it anyway. She just wished she knew whether this was principle or something else entirely. Something that felt uncomfortably like curiosity about Duke Adrian Blackthorn himself, not his reforms or his factories or his calculated kindness, but the grief she'd glimpsed in his face when Catherine asked what had changed his mind. Consequences, he'd said. But Elena suspected the real answer was buried somewhere deeper, in whatever wound had turned a ruthless industrialist into a reformer who didn't want credit for his reforms. She told herself it didn't matter, that his motives were irrelevant as long as the outcomes improved lives. But 2 hours later, pulling into London with her notebook full of evidence that Blackthorn was exactly what he claimed to be, Elena couldn't stop wondering what kind of consequence could change a man that thoroughly, and whether she was about to become one of them. The letter came 3 weeks after Manchester, delivered by a boy too young to understand the weight of what he carried. Elena tipped him a penny and closed the door before breaking the seal. Unmarked wax, expensive paper, handwriting she didn't recognize. Miss Veermont, your presence at the Blackthorn estate last month has been noted with interest by those who value social order. We write not as enemies, but as concerned citizens offering guidance. Distance yourself from the Duke immediately, or face consequences that will extend beyond your own reputation. Consider this your only warning. The names below represent families whose approval you cannot afford to lose. 15 signatures followed. Elena recognized all of them. Old money, old titles, the kind of power that didn't need to shout because it controlled the room by existing in it. Lady Ashford's name headed the list. The Duchess of Pembroke's appeared third. Catherine, reading over her shoulder, swore with impressive creativity. They're threatening you. They're warning me. Elena read it again, looking for the trap beneath the civility. There's a difference. Not one that matters. Catherine grabbed the letter, studying the signatures. Half these families have investments in factories that make Blackthorn's old operations look humane. They're not protecting social order, they're protecting profit margins. If his reforms spread, they'll lose millions. Elena had reached the same conclusion. Blackthorn's changes weren't just moral statements, they were economic threats. Better conditions meant higher costs. Higher costs meant lower profits. And men who'd built empires on cheap labor wouldn't surrender those empires quietly. They think I'm influencing him, Elena said slowly. That the reforms are my doing, not his. Are they? No. He'd already started before we met. She took the letter back, folding it carefully. But it doesn't matter what's true, it matters what they believe. What they believed, apparently, was that Elena Viramont, impoverished, unmarried, socially insignificant, had somehow convinced one of England's most powerful dukes to undermine his own industry. It would be flattering if it weren't so dangerous. You need to respond, Catherine said, publicly. Make it clear you have no influence over Blackthorn's business decisions. That's lying. That's surviving. Catherine's voice sharpened. Elena, these people will destroy you. Not figuratively, actually destroy you. No invitations means no social connections. No connections means no employment prospects. No prospects means poverty. Real poverty, not just reduced circumstances. You'll end up in Whitechapel yourself, teaching children whose parents work the same factories you're trying to reform. Elena knew she was right, had known it since the letter arrived. But something in her refused to bend, the same stubborn conviction that had driven her into that ballroom 3 weeks ago. If I distance myself now, nothing changes. Blackthorn continues his reforms alone. The other factory owners continue their exploitation, and I've wasted 2 years of work for nothing. You'll have wasted your entire life if you're ruined. I'm already ruined. Elena gestured at her modest parlor, the threadbare furniture she couldn't afford to replace. I have no dowry, no prospects, no family worth mentioning. What exactly do I have left to lose? Your safety. The word hung between them, sharp and true. Catherine was right about that too. Men with enough power and threatened profits didn't stop at social exclusion. They found other ways to silence problems. I'll be careful, Elena said. You said that before Manchester. Look where it got you. Before Elena could respond, someone knocked. Hard. Urgent. Catherine went pale. Elena felt her own heart accelerate. Anonymous threatening letters followed by unexpected visitors rarely meant anything good. She opened the door and found Lord Garrett Thorne standing there, rain-soaked and breathing like he'd run the whole way. You need to leave London. Tonight. Elena stared at him. What? The letter you received this morning, did you respond to it? How do you know about... Because I was at the club when they were writing it, bragging about it, actually, like teaching you a lesson was sport. Garrett pushed inside without invitation, water dripping on her floor. And when you didn't respond by noon, they decided words weren't sufficient. Catherine closed the door, turning the lock. What does that mean? It means there's a plan to ruin her completely, not just socially, criminally. Garrett looked at Elena, his expression somewhere between anger and genuine concern. They're going to plant evidence that you've been embezzling from the charitable funds you manage. Forged documents showing you diverted donations meant for Whitechapel families into your own accounts. By tomorrow morning, you'll be arrested for theft. The floor seemed to tilt. Elena grabbed the back of a chair. That's insane. Doesn't matter. The evidence will be convincing. They have magistrates who'll sign warrants, constables who'll execute them, and newspapers ready to print the story before you've even seen the inside of a cell. Garrett's hands were shaking. I'm telling you this because I owe you nothing and them less, and because what they're doing is wrong even by their standards. But you have maybe 6 hours to get out of London before this becomes irreversible. 6 hours? Catherine's voice cracked. To go where? Do what? Anywhere that isn't here. Scotland, maybe. France, if you can manage it. Just not London. Garrett moved toward the door. I've done what I can. The rest is up to you. Wait! Elena's mind raced, trying to find footing in information coming too fast. Why are they doing this now? The reforms have been happening for months. Because Blackthorn's scheduled to present a proposal to Parliament next week. Factory safety standards, mandatory education provisions, limits on child labor. If it passes, every industrialist in England will be forced to follow his model. Garrett opened the door, checking the street. They blame you for pushing him toward it. They're probably wrong. Blackthorn doesn't need pushing. But perception is all that matters. You're the variable they can eliminate, so they will. He left before Elena could respond, disappearing into the rain-dark afternoon like a messenger from a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Catherine broke first, grabbing Elena's shoulders. "Pack, now. We'll go to my cousin in Edinburgh." "No." "Elena, I'm not running." The words came out steadier than Elena felt. "If I leave, they win." Blackthorn's proposal dies because the woman who supposedly influenced him is a convicted thief. The reforms stop. Everything we've worked for ends. Better that than you in prison. "Is it?" Elena pulled away, pacing the small room. "They're counting on me running. It confirms guilt, removes the problem, discredits the cause. But if I stay, if I fight this publicly, you lose. You lose badly and publicly and permanently." Catherine's voice was desperate now. "Please, for once in your life, choose survival over principle." "Principle is survival. It's the only thing I have that's actually mine." "You're not thinking clearly." She wasn't. Elena knew that. Terror and anger were making decisions her rational mind would probably regret. But beneath the fear was something else, a cold fury at men who thought they could destroy her for daring to care about children's mangled hands and women's ruined lungs. "I need to see Blackthorn." Catherine went very still. "No. He needs to know what's happening. If his proposal is threatened." "His proposal?" "Elena, you're about to be arrested for crimes you didn't commit, and you're worried about his business agenda?" "I'm worried about the 800 people in his Manchester factory who'll go back to 14-hour shifts if this fails, and the thousands more in other factories who'll never see reforms at all." Elena grabbed her coat. "He has resources, connections. Maybe he can stop this. Or maybe he's part of it." Catherine's voice was flat. "Did that occur to you? That the Duke might have orchestrated this whole thing, the reforms, the invitation, the consultation, just to position himself politically, and now that you're a liability, he's cutting you loose?" "No, he wouldn't. You don't know that. You don't know him." Elena stopped, coat half on. Catherine was right. She didn't know Blackthorn, had spent exactly one day in his presence, heard his carefully constructed explanations, accepted his offer of paid consultation without questioning why he'd want her specifically. Maybe it had all been manipulation. Maybe she was the fool Catherine suspected. But something in the way he'd looked at those children learning to read, in the grief that crossed his face when asked what changed him, that hadn't felt calculated. It had felt true. And Elena had built her entire life on trusting her instincts about truth. "I'm going to his London residence," she said. "If he turns me away, I'll know you were right, but I have to try." "Then I'm coming with you." "Catherine, absolutely not negotiable. You don't get to martyr yourself without a witness." Catherine grabbed her own coat. "Besides, someone needs to document this disaster for the history books." The Blackthorn residence occupied a corner of Mayfair that even Elena's reduced circumstances couldn't help her avoid recognizing. Old wealth, older architecture, the kind of address that appeared in society columns without needing explanation. She'd passed it before, never imagining she'd actually approach the door. Rain turned the evening to gray soup. Elena climbed the steps and knocked, Catherine hovering behind her like a hostile guardian angel. A butler answered, older, distinguished, utterly unsurprised by two drenched women appearing at 9 in the evening. "May I help you?" "I need to speak with the Duke. It's urgent. His Grace is not receiving visitors this evening. It's about his parliamentary proposal and a threat that will destroy it before it reaches a vote." Elena met the butler's eyes, letting him see her desperation. "Please, 5 minutes. That's all I need." Something shifted in his expression, calculation or compassion, Elena couldn't tell. "Wait here." He closed the door. Elena and Catherine stood in the rain, water soaking through their coats, the night pressing close with all its dangers. "He won't see you," Catherine murmured. "Probably not. And even if he does, he can't fix this. No one can." "I know." "Then why—" The door opened. The butler stepped aside. "His Grace will give you 10 minutes. Follow me." They entered a house that somehow managed to be both opulent and austere, expensive everything, but chosen for function rather than display. No gilded excess, No portraits of ancestors sneering from walls. Just clean lines and quality materials and the kind of restraint that came from having nothing left to prove. The butler led them to a study on the second floor, knocked once, and departed without ceremony. "Come in." Blackthorne sat behind a desk covered in papers, still dressed for business despite the late hour. He looked up as they entered, and whatever expression he'd been wearing vanished into something Elena couldn't read at all. "Miss Viremont, Miss Hartley." He stood, gesturing to chairs. "I assume this isn't a social call. They're going to frame me for embezzlement." Elena stayed standing, too wired to sit. "The factory owners, the ones opposing your reforms, they've forged evidence, bribed officials, and plan to have me arrested tomorrow morning. I came to warn you that your proposal is probably compromised too." Blackthorne was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "I know." The words hit like cold water. Elena felt Catherine's hand grip her arm, steadying or restraining. "You know, I was informed this afternoon. My sources in the Home Office are occasionally useful." Blackthorne moved around the desk, leaning against it with a casualness that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "I've been deciding how to respond. And," Catherine's voice was ice, "and I have 2 options. Let it proceed and distance myself from Miss Viremont publicly, which preserves my political position and sacrifices her. Or intervene, which saves her but confirms the opposition's narrative that she influences my decisions." "How generous of you to consider her survival as an option," Catherine snapped. Blackthorne's gaze didn't waver. "I'm explaining the calculation, not the conclusion. Miss Hartley, you're right to distrust me. Most people in your position would." "Be it that Miss Defiance." He looked at Elena. "But you're not most people, are you?" "Is that a compliment or an accusation?" "An observation." He pushed away from the desk, pacing now. "You walked into a ballroom and accused me of crimes I'd already started fixing. Then you came to Manchester expecting to find evidence of exploitation and instead found reform. Now you're here, threatened with prison, and your first concern is protecting work that benefits strangers. You're either remarkably principled or remarkably foolish. Can I be both?" Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, too quick to confirm. "Probably." He stopped pacing, decision crystallizing. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling in favors from 3 magistrates, 2 newspaper editors, and the Home Secretary himself. The forged documents will be exposed as forgery. The officials involved will face charges. Your name will be cleared before it's officially tarnished." Elena's breath caught. "You can do that?" "I can. Whether I should is the more interesting question." Blackthorne's voice was clinical, analyzing the problem like factory efficiency. "The opposition will retaliate, probably against both of us. My proposal faces longer odds. Your safety becomes my responsibility, which creates obligations I normally avoid." "Then why help me?" "Because you're right." He said it simply, like stating fact. About the reforms, about the principle, about the fact that legality isn't morality. And because letting them destroy you for caring would make me complicit in exactly the kind of calculated cruelty I've spent 2 years trying to eliminate from my own operations. Catherine made a noise that might have been relief or disbelief. "So you're doing this out of principle?" "I'm doing this because the alternative is unacceptable. Call it whatever you like." Blackthorne looked at Elena. "But understand the cost. After tomorrow, you'll be publicly associated with me. My allies become yours. My enemies definitely become yours. You won't be an independent reformer anymore. You'll be seen as my agent. That changes everything." "I didn't ask to be your agent." "No. But you came here anyway, knowing I was your best chance at survival. That's already a compromise." His voice softened slightly. "I'm not offering to rescue you, Miss Viremont. I'm offering a strategic alliance. You continue your work, I protect you from retaliation, and together we accomplish more than either could alone. It's practical, not noble." Elena studied his face, looking for the manipulation Catherine kept warning about. All she saw was exhaustion and that same distant grief from Manchester, buried under layers of control that must cost him effort to maintain. "What do you get from this alliance?" she asked. Someone who tells me the truth when my reforms fail. Someone who cares about outcomes more than credit. Someone who... He paused, choosing words carefully. Reminds me why this work matters when the board of directors spends 5 hours arguing about ventilation costs. That's not an equal exchange. You're taking all the risk. Risk is relative. I have resources to absorb retaliation. You don't. That makes protecting you strategically sound. Blackthorn returned to his desk, pulling out fresh paper. I'll need a signed statement from you detailing everything you know about the embezzlement plot. Names, dates, methods. My solicitor will file it with the magistrate at dawn. And then? Then you stay here. The words dropped into silence. Catherine stood up. Absolutely not. It's not negotiable. Blackthorn's voice stayed level. The moment I intervene, Miss Viremont becomes a target. My residence has security, hers doesn't. She stays until the situation stabilizes. For how long? As long as necessary. He looked at Elena. I have guest quarters prepared. You'll have privacy. Freedom to come and go during daylight hours. Access to my library and resources. What you won't have is the option to make yourself an easy target for men angry that their schemes failed. Elena's mind spun through implications. Moving into Blackthorn's residence, even temporarily, would destroy what little reputation she had left. Society would assume the worst immediately. Every reform effort would be tainted by association with scandal. But staying in her townhouse meant making herself available for the next attack. And there would be a next one. This is insane, Catherine whispered. Probably, Elena agreed. But she was looking at Blackthorn, at the way he waited for her decision without pressure or persuasion. Just facts laid out clearly, choice offered genuinely. She thought about those children in the education annex, about Mary at her loom, 17 years old with lungs still clear, about the 800 workers whose lives had improved because one man had decided consequences mattered more than profits. And she thought about the alternative, running to Scotland, abandoning the work, letting powerful men win because fighting them was too dangerous. I'll stay, she said, temporarily, until this resolves. Catherine grabbed her arm. Elena, you can't. The scandal. I'm already scandalous. Might as well make it count. Elena pulled away gently. Go home, Catherine. You don't need to be associated with this disaster. I'm not leaving you here. You have to. Your family, your reputation. I won't let you sacrifice that. Then you understand exactly why I won't let you do this. Catherine's eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. We've been friends for 10 years. I'm not abandoning you to a duke's questionable protection and calling it wisdom. Blackthorn cleared his throat. Miss Hartley, you're welcome to verify the accommodations if it eases your concern. But Miss Viremont is correct about the risk to your own position. Association with this situation will damage you. I don't care. You should. His voice carried unexpected gentleness. Sacrificing yourself doesn't help her. It just means you both lose. Catherine looked between them, fury and fear warring in her expression. Finally, she grabbed Elena in a hug that felt like goodbye, even though they both pretended it wasn't. If he harms you, he won't. If he betrays you, I'll survive. I always do. Elena held her friend tight. Go, please. Catherine left without another word, back straight and eyes forward. Elena heard her footsteps descending the stairs, heard the front door close with terrible finality. Then it was just her and Blackthorn in a study that suddenly felt too quiet. You're frightened, he said. Not a question. Yes. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. He began writing on the fresh paper, his hand steady where Elena's would have shaken. I'll have your belongings collected from your townhouse tomorrow. Tonight you'll make do with borrowed items. Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms. The housekeeper? She's been with my family for 30 years. She'll ensure your comfort and propriety. Blackthorn finished writing, blotted the ink. For what it's worth, Miss Viremont, I don't make offers I don't intend to honor. You're safe here. That's not negotiable either. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this cold, calculating man was genuinely offering protection rather than a more sophisticated form of control. But Catherine's words echoed, perfect things are always traps. Why are you really doing this? She asked. The truth, not the strategic justification. Blackthorne looked up from his desk, and for just a moment, the careful distance cracked. Beneath it, Elena saw something raw and barely healed. Grief too deep for words, guilt that hadn't found absolution. Because 3 years ago I failed to protect someone who mattered, and I've spent every day since trying to calculate my way out of that failure. His voice was quiet, almost painful. I know protection doesn't erase mistakes, but it's all I have to offer. So yes, this is strategic, and yes, it benefits my proposal. But it's also, he paused, searching for words, necessary, for reasons I can't fully explain to you or myself. Elena understood then, or thought she did. This wasn't about her at all. It was about whoever he'd lost. Whatever consequence had changed him so completely that reforming factories felt like penance. She was just convenient, a problem that aligned with his need to fix things he couldn't fix in himself. It should have felt insulting. Instead, it felt almost comfortingly honest. "All right," she said. "I'll write the statement." He slid paper and pen across the desk. Elena sat down and began documenting everything. Garrett's warning, the letter's signatures, the timeline of the plot. Her handwriting looked shaky even to her own eyes, fear bleeding through precision. Blackthorne read over her shoulder, silent and focused. When she finished, he took the pages without comment and locked them in a drawer. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you upstairs. Try to sleep if you can. Tomorrow will be complicated." "Your Grace, Adrian." He said it without looking at her. "If we're allying against half of London's elite, you might as well use my name." "Adrian, then." The name felt strange in her mouth, too informal and too late to take back. "Thank you for this. Don't thank me yet. You might regret it by morning." He finally looked up, and Elena saw exhaustion etched in lines around his eyes. "I've been told I'm difficult to work with, demanding, cold, probably all true. If you change your mind about this arrangement, tell me directly. I'll make other provisions." "I won't change my mind." "You say that now." Something shifted in his expression, almost a smile, but sadder. "But I've noticed you have strong opinions and flexible loyalty to comfort. It makes you unpredictable." "Is that a problem?" "No." He returned to his papers, dismissing her. "It's refreshing. Now go rest before I find something else for you to document. Mrs. Hartwell appeared as if summoned, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the kind of competent calm that suggested nothing surprised her anymore. She led Elena upstairs without comment, through hallways lined with closed doors and quiet shadows. The guest room was larger than Elena's entire townhouse, clean, spare, expensive, in the way that didn't need announcement. A nightgown had been laid out on the bed, simple white cotton that probably cost more than everything Elena owned. "Breakfast at 8, miss, unless you prefer earlier. His Grace keeps London hours even when Parliament isn't in session." Mrs. Hartwell moved to the windows, drawing heavy curtains. "You're safe here. The staff has been told you're a business consultant. They'll treat you accordingly." "Business consultant," Elena repeated. "Is that what I am?" "It's what you'll be called. What you actually are is between you and His Grace." Mrs. Hartwell paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I've watched that man torture himself with guilt for 3 years. Tonight's the first time I've seen him look almost alive. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." She left before Elena could ask what she meant. Elena stood in a stranger's guest room, wearing a stranger's nightgown, her entire life reduced to borrowed quarters and provisional safety. Outside, rain hammered against windows that faced a city where powerful men wanted her destroyed. Tomorrow, Adrian, she couldn't think of him as Blackthorne anymore, not after he'd offered his name like a secret, would fight those men using resources she couldn't imagine and strategies she didn't understand. And she'd be here, safe and useless, watching her fate decided by someone else's intervention. It felt like surrender, like accepting that she couldn't fight this battle alone, that principle without power was just noise, that surviving meant compromising everything she'd tried to stand for. Elena climbed into bed that smelled like lavender and privilege, pulled covers over exhaustion she hadn't admitted until now, and let herself cry for the first time since the letter arrived. Not from fear, not from gratitude, from the terrible understanding that she'd just traded independence for protection, and she couldn't quite tell if that made her smart or broken. Somewhere below, she heard Adrian still working, papers shuffling, pen scratching, the sound of someone who'd forgotten how to rest, because stopping meant thinking about things that hurt too much to examine. And despite everything, the danger, the scandal, the complete upheaval of her life in the space of 6 hours, Elena felt something she didn't expect. Not quite trust, not quite hope. Just the smallest, most fragile possibility that maybe, in this calculated alliance between two damaged people trying to fix a broken system, something true might actually survive. She woke to voices arguing somewhere below her window. Elena lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by ceiling molding she didn't recognize and light coming from the wrong direction. Then memory crashed back. The letter, the threat, Adrian's study, this borrowed room in a duke's house where she'd apparently slept through her own catastrophe. The voices grew louder. She caught fragments. Absolutely reckless. And the board will never... And then Adrian's response, too quiet to hear but sharp enough to cut the other voice short. The clock on the mantel read 9:30. She'd missed breakfast by an hour and a half. Elena dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, wrinkled, inappropriate, all she had until her belongings arrived. If they arrived. For all she knew, her townhouse had been raided overnight and everything she owned was being cataloged as evidence of crimes she hadn't committed. She found her way downstairs by following the argument. It led to a morning room where Adrian stood by the windows, already dressed for business despite the early hour. Across from him, a man in his 50s paced with the agitation of someone who'd been dismissed too many times and kept coming back anyway. Endangering everything we've built for a woman you barely know. Thomas. Adrian's voice carried warning. We've discussed this. No, you've decided, and I'm expected to implement whatever madness. The man stopped mid-sentence, noticing Elena in the doorway. His face went carefully blank. Ms. Vermont, how convenient. Thomas serves as my business manager, Adrian said without looking at her. He's concerned about yesterday's developments. Concerned? Thomas laughed without humor. I'm watching you destroy a decade of political capital for someone who publicly accused you of exploitation 3 weeks ago. Concerned doesn't begin to cover it. Elena stepped into the room, refusing to be dismissed. What happened? Did they... The magistrates declined to issue warrants. Adrian turned from the window, and Elena saw exhaustion carved into his face that hadn't been there last night. The forged documents were exposed this morning, along with the names of everyone involved in creating them. 3 officials are under investigation. The Times will run the story tomorrow. Relief hit so hard, Elena had to grip the door frame. It worked. It worked because His Grace spent the entire night calling in every favor accumulated over 15 years. Thomas's voice was acid. Favors we needed for the parliamentary proposal. Favors that are now spent protecting you instead of pushing reforms that could have helped thousands. Thomas, enough. No, it's not enough. You want to know what the board said this morning? They said withdraw the proposal. Said associating with a woman of questionable reputation, their words, not mine, makes you politically toxic. Said they won't support reforms tied to scandal. Adrian's jaw tightened. The board doesn't make my decisions. The board controls 40% of company voting shares. They absolutely make your decisions. Thomas stopped pacing, facing Adrian directly. You've built something remarkable. Safer factories, better conditions, actual change in an industry that resists it. But you're throwing it away for... He gestured at Elena. For what exactly? Principle? Sentiment? Some misguided attempt to redeem past failures? The words landed like blows. Elena watched Adrian's face, waiting for denial or defense. He offered neither. My motivations aren't your concern. They are when they affect every worker in every facility we operate. You think you're protecting her? You're sacrificing them. Thomas grabbed his coat. The board meets again tomorrow. They'll force a vote to remove you from operational control if you don't distance yourself from this situation. Think about that before you make any more noble gestures. He left without acknowledging Elena's presence. The door closing behind him sounded final. Adrian remained by the window, staring at nothing. You should eat. Mrs. Hartwell saved you breakfast. What did he mean about past failures? It's not relevant. It sounded relevant. Elena moved closer, studying his profile. Who did you fail to protect? Someone I married. The words came out flat, emotionless. Someone who died because I was too focused on business to notice she was drowning in a life she never wanted. Someone whose last words to me were, "You're never actually here, are you?" And she was right. I was physically present but mentally calculating profit margins while he stopped, jaw working, while she decided being alone was preferable to being married to an absence. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She took her own life. The official report said accidental drowning. She went riding alone. The horse returned without her. They found her in the pond on the east property. Adrian's voice stayed level, reciting facts. But I knew. I'd known she was struggling for months and did nothing because doing something meant admitting my failure. Easier to pretend everything was fine and bury myself in work that had measurable outcomes. It is. Exactly that. He finally looked at her, and the grief in his eyes was 3 years old and fresh as yesterday. So when Thomas accuses me of seeking redemption through questionable decisions, he's not wrong. I can't save Elizabeth, but I can prevent other preventable suffering. It's insufficient and probably pathological, but it's all I have. Elena didn't know what to say, how to respond to pain laid bare like that, without armor or deflection. So she just stood there, bearing witness to confession he probably regretted already. "I should withdraw the proposal," Adrian said quietly. "Thomas is right about that too. Pushing forward now jeopardizes everything. Or it forces the opposition to show their hand publicly." The words came out before Elena thought them through. "They tried to destroy me quietly, forged documents, private pressure. But you exposed them, made it public. They're scrambling now, trying to regain control through the board. What if instead of withdrawing, you escalate? Escalate how? Make me official, your factory reform consultant, hired and paid, working publicly on safety improvements. They can't call it scandal if it's legitimate employment. And it makes the opposition's attacks look like what they are, retaliation against worker protections, not moral outrage." Adrian studied her. "That makes you a permanent target, not just until this settles, permanently." "I was already a target. At least this way I'm a target doing something useful." Elena felt the idea gaining solidity as she spoke it. "You need someone outside your system to verify reforms work. I need employment that can't be destroyed by social exclusion. It's practical, not noble. Your own logic." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or reassessment. "You're suggesting we make the scandal functional. I'm suggesting we make it true. You said I'd be seen as your agent either way, so make it official. Pay me properly. Give me real authority to inspect and report. Make the opposition fight against worker safety instead of questionable morality. The board will still fight it. Let them, publicly. Force them to argue against factory safety in newspapers where workers can read their names." Elena felt energy building, the kind that came when impossible problems suddenly showed angles of attack. Right now they control the narrative. Scandalous woman influences foolish duke. Change it, make it. Qualified consultant implements proven reforms while opposition protects profits over children's lives. Which story wins? Adrian walked to his desk, pulling out papers covered in notes from last night's crisis management. He studied them in silence for long enough that Elena started wondering if she'd overstepped. Then he looked up. "The board meets at 2 tomorrow. I'll present your employment as fait accompli, already decided, already implemented. They can accept it or force a vote to remove me. Either way, we find out how committed they are to fighting this. And if they remove you, then I lose operational control and you lose your employment. But the publicity from that fight might push the parliamentary proposal forward anyway." He started writing, that same focused intensity from last night. "It's risky, probably stupid, almost certainly going to fail spectacularly. So you'll do it." Apparently. He didn't smile, but something in his voice lightened fractionally. "I'm starting to see why Thomas finds you concerning." A knock interrupted whatever Elena might have said. Mrs. Hartwell appeared, looking uncertain in a way that didn't suit her. "Your Grace, there's a situation in the front entrance." "What kind of situation?" "Reporters, sir, at least a dozen. And Miss Hartley, demanding to see Miss Viremont. And—" She paused. Several members of the board of directors who say they need to speak with you immediately. Adrian and Elena exchanged looks. The exposure had worked faster than expected. Tomorrow's newspaper story had become today's crisis. Show the board to the study. Tell the reporters I'll make a statement at 11. And send Miss Hartley up. She can verify Elena's well-being and take that concern off the table. Mrs. Hartwell nodded and disappeared. Adrian grabbed his jacket, transforming from exhausted confidant back into controlled authority. Stay here. Don't speak to the board or the reporters without me present. I'm not helpless. No. But you're untrained in handling hostile interrogation disguised as polite inquiry. Let me manage it. He moved toward the door, then stopped. What you suggested, making this official, it has merit. But understand what you're choosing. This isn't temporary employment until scandal fades. This is permanent association with me, my work, my reputation. Everything I am becomes attached to you. Everything you are becomes attached to me. That's not a consultancy. That's a partnership. I know. Do you? Because partnerships require trust. I'm not certain I'm capable of anymore. Elizabeth trusted me, and I let her down so completely His voice cracked. I'm not offering safety, Elena, just slightly different danger. I'll take it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Then he left to face whatever waited in his study. Catherine arrived 3 minutes later, bursting into the room like weather itself. Are you all right? The papers are saying you're under ducal protection, which sounds medieval and probably is, and there are rumors you're secretly his mistress, which is ridiculous, and she stopped, actually looking at Elena. You slept here. In a guest room, chaperoned by a housekeeper. That won't matter to anyone who wants to destroy you. Catherine grabbed Elena's hands. Tell me you have a plan. Tell me this isn't just noble suicide. We're making it official. I'm being hired as factory reform consultant. Paid position, public records, legitimate employment. That's not better. That's just different scandal. But Catherine's voice had lost some of its panic. Although I suppose being employed is better than being ruined, marginally. Catherine, I'm sorry for dragging you into this, Stop. I chose to be here. I choose to stay. Catherine sat down heavily. But you need to know, the women who signed that letter, they're organizing, calling it a morality campaign. They plan to petition Parliament against Blackthorne's proposal, citing his association with you as evidence of compromised judgment. Let them. It makes them look like they're protecting exploitation. Only if the narrative holds. If it breaks, if they successfully paint this as a duke seduced into bad policy by a scheming woman, everything collapses. Catherine met Elena's eyes. You need to be perfect. Beyond reproach. No mistakes, no questionable decisions, nothing they can use against you. I'm not capable of perfect. Then be strategically imperfect. Make mistakes that don't matter. Succeed where it counts. And for the love of... She caught herself. For sanity's sake, don't actually fall for him. Elena felt heat rise in her face. That's not... It is. I saw how you looked at him last night, like he was solving equations and you were impressed by the math. Catherine's voice gentled. I understand. He's brilliant and broken and doing good things for complicated reasons. That's catnip for someone like you. But he's also a duke with dead wife he's still mourning and board of directors ready to destroy both of you. Romance is the worst possible complication. There's no romance. Not yet. Keep it that way. Voices rose from downstairs, Adrian's cutting through others with authority that permitted no argument. The board meeting was happening now, ahead of schedule, probably because they'd seen the reporters outside and panicked. I should go, Catherine said. Being seen here helps neither of us, but I'll be at my cousin's townhouse. Send word if you need anything. Anything at all. She left before Elena could thank her properly. The morning room felt too large suddenly, too quiet except for muffled argument from below. Elena moved to the window and watched Catherine navigate through the reporters camped on Adrian's front steps. They shouted questions. Catherine ignored them with the kind of practiced disdain that came from growing up adjacent to wealth without possessing it. The reporters looked hungry. Not for truth, for story. The narrative Catherine had warned about was forming already, shaped by whatever sold papers and confirmed biases. Duke's folly. Scheming woman. Moral decay disguised as reform. They'd need a different story. A better one. True enough to be verified, compelling enough to spread, simple enough that workers reading it in penny papers would understand what was actually at stake. Elena grabbed paper from Adrian's desk and started writing. Not a defense. Defenses sounded guilty. An explanation, clear, factual, focused on outcomes over personalities. She'd learned something from Adrian after all. Don't argue motivations, demonstrate results. 40 minutes later, when the board members stormed out of the study looking furious and impotent, Elena had a statement ready. Adrian found her still writing, surrounded by crumpled false starts. They've demanded I resign. I've refused. They'll call an emergency shareholders meeting to force a vote. He looked at her pages. What's this? A statement for the reporters. Facts about factory reforms. Implementation timelines, worker safety improvements. Nothing about scandal or personal attacks, just measurable outcomes tied to your decisions. He read it in silence. When he looked up, his expression had shifted into something Elena couldn't quite read. This is good. Better than good. It's exactly the right approach. I learned from watching you. Facts without apology. Let the opposition defend their positions publicly. You're a quick study. He grabbed his jacket again. I'm making that statement at 11. I want you beside me. Visible, official, employed. We make the partnership real starting now. The board can fight me on it, but once it's public, backing down becomes harder. We establish facts before they can control perception. He paused at the door. Are you certain about this? Once we step outside together, there's no retreat that doesn't look like guilt or cowardice. Elena thought about those children learning to read, about Mary with her clear lungs, about 2 years of work that had finally, impossibly, found purchase in the real world. I'm certain. At 11 o'clock exactly, Adrian opened his front door and faced 24 reporters with Elena standing 3 feet behind him. Close enough to be clearly present, far enough to avoid looking possessive. The positioning itself was a statement. I'll read a brief statement and take limited questions, Adrian said. His voice carried the kind of authority that made even hostile crowds listen. Yesterday, several individuals attempted to frame Miss Elena Viermont for embezzlement using forged documents. The scheme has been exposed, and those responsible are under investigation. Miss Viermont was targeted because of her work consulting on factory safety reforms, work I commissioned and compensate fairly. Any questions about her character are transparent attempts to undermine worker protections by attacking the person implementing them. The reporters erupted with questions. Adrian held up a hand. Miss Viermont is now my official factory reform consultant. She will have full access to all Blackthorn facilities, authority to inspect and report on conditions, and independence to publish findings regardless of whether they reflect favorably on my operations. Her salary and terms are public record. Any claims of impropriety should address themselves to the documented facts of her employment, not speculation about personal relationships that don't exist. He gestured Elena forward. She stepped up, heart hammering, but voice steady. I've spent 2 years documenting factory abuses and advocating for worker protections. The Duke's facilities now demonstrate that reforms are both possible and profitable when implemented correctly. I'll be verifying those claims through continued inspection and publishing regular reports on progress. The goal isn't to defend the Duke, it's to establish standards that protect workers across the industry. A reporter near the front shouted over the others, Miss Viermont, are you residing at His Grace's residence? Temporarily, due to security concerns following yesterday's threats. Arrangements are chaperoned and appropriate. How long is temporary? Until alternative secure housing can be arranged. Elena had practiced this with Adrian. My employment requires access to documentation stored here. Efficiency suggested proximity. The Duchess of Pembroke says your influence over the Duke proves he's unfit for... The Duchess of Pembroke's family owns textile factories operating under conditions I documented in the Workers' Defense Quarterly. Elena cut in. Her concern about my influence seems directly proportional to her concern about profit margins. I'd be happy to provide those documented conditions for publication if it helps readers evaluate her objectivity. A ripple went through the crowd. Appreciation for blood in the water. Adrian's hand touched her elbow briefly, warning or support. That's all we're addressing today, he said. Written questions can be submitted through my secretary. Thank you. He ushered Elena back inside before the shouted questions could become a mob. The door closed on chaos. That last bit about the Duchess, Adrian said. Calculated risk or impulse? Both. Was it wrong? No, it was perfect, aggressive enough to show strength, factual enough to avoid libel, personal enough to make them think twice about attacking again. He actually smiled. Thomas is going to hate you even more. I can live with that. Good. Because the shareholders' meeting is in 3 days and it's going to be much worse than reporters. His smile faded. They'll try to separate us. Offer me continuation if I fire you, offer you settlement if you resign. Whatever we decided today about partnership, it gets tested then. I won't break. Neither will I. He said it like a vow. But understand what we're building. Not just employment or political alliance, something that requires both of us to hold position even when retreat looks rational. That's harder than it sounds when the consequences start accumulating. Elena thought about the last 3 weeks. The ballroom confrontation, the Manchester tour, the forged documents, this morning's gauntlet. Every decision had led here, to standing in a Duke's entrance hall planning strategy against people who controlled industries and parliaments. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like clarity. I've been accumulating consequences my entire adult life, she said. I'm used to it. That's what concerns me. But Adrian's voice carried something that might have been respect. Most people learn to avoid consequences. You walk toward them deliberately. It's either brave or pathological. Can't I be both? Probably. He checked his watch. I need to brief my solicitor before the shareholders' meeting. You should document everything from this morning, times, quotes, reactions. Build a record we can reference if this goes to court. You think it will? I think when powerful men start losing, they explore every available weapon. Court is just one option. He moved toward his study, then paused. Elena, what you said out there about my facilities demonstrating reforms are possible? Did you mean it, or was it strategic positioning? Both. The reforms are real. They're also insufficient in places and overdue everywhere, but they're better than what existed before. That's worth defending. Even if defending them ties you permanently to someone you barely know? I know enough. You changed your mind when confronted with consequences. You implement solutions instead of just acknowledging problems. You protect people at cost to yourself. Elena met his eyes. That's more than most people in your position would do. It's enough to warrant partnership. Something complicated passed across his face. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition of something he'd stopped expecting to find in other people. I hope you still think that in 3 days, after the shareholders have finished explaining exactly why I'm the worst possible ally. He disappeared into the study before Elena could respond. She stood in the entrance hall, listening to London traffic beyond the walls, feeling the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade now. Catherine was right about one thing. This was dangerous. Not just socially, structurally. She'd tied her fate to Adrian so completely that his failure became hers, his victories hers, his complicated grief and calculated redemption, all tangled with her own need to fix things she couldn't fix in herself. It wasn't romance. Catherine was wrong about that. But it was something. Recognition, maybe, of two people whose damage aligned in ways that let them build something neither could construct alone. Elena went upstairs to document the morning, to prepare for the next battle, to do what she'd always done when the world proved hostile. Work harder, think clearer, refuse to break just because breaking would be easier. Somewhere in the study below, Adrian did the same. And outside, London watched and whispered and waited to see which of them would fracture first under pressure that was only beginning to build. But 3 days later, when the shareholders' meeting convened in a room designed to intimidate and filled with men determined to destroy them both, something shifted. Not in the outcome. The vote was close, brutal, exactly as predicted. Adrian retained operational control by a margin of 7 votes, bought with promises Elena suspected cost him more than he'd acknowledge. But afterward, when the board members filed out still angry but legally bound to his decisions, one of them stopped. Lord Ashford, husband to the woman who'd hosted the ball where this all started, looked at Elena with reassessment instead of dismissal. "Your report on the Manchester facility," he said. "I read it thoroughly." Elena waited, expecting attack disguised as inquiry. It was fair. Noted problems alongside improvements. Didn't pretend everything was perfect. He glanced at Adrian, then back to her. "I own 3 factories in Birmingham. Conditions are probably worse than I know. If I hired you to assess them, honestly, no politics, would you do it?" The room went very quiet. Adrian's expression showed nothing, but Elena felt his attention sharpen. "Yes," she said. "Same terms, same independence, same public reporting of findings. Even if those findings damage my reputation? Especially then. Results matter more than reputation." Lord Ashford nodded slowly. "I'll contact you through Blackthorn's secretary. Set it up properly." He left without ceremony. Elena looked at Adrian. "Did that just—" "Yes." He sounded almost disbelieving. "He just legitimized your consultancy in front of the entire board, which means others will follow." "Why would he do that?" "Because he read your report and found it credible. Because his factories are probably liability nightmares and he needs outside assessment. Because—" Adrian paused. "Because you gave him truth without agenda, and men in our position rarely encounter that. It's valuable." They walked out of the shareholders' building into afternoon light that felt different somehow, softer, less hostile. The reporters were still there, but their questions had shifted from scandal to specifics about reform timelines and consultation fees. The narrative had changed, not completely. There were still plenty of people convinced Elena was either scheming or deluded, but enough doubt had crept in, enough evidence accumulated that the simple story of Duke's folly didn't quite hold anymore. It had become complicated, nuanced, real in ways that made dismissal harder. "We should celebrate," Adrian said as they reached his carriage. "Dinner somewhere public. Make the partnership visible." "Is that wise?" "Probably not, but we just survived an attempted coup by my own board of directors. Wisdom seems beside the point." Elena climbed into the carriage, watching London pass outside windows that no longer felt like walls of a trap. "Where did you have in mind?" "Somewhere expensive and respectable. The kind of place scandal can't quite penetrate because the prices are too high." He smiled slightly. "Besides, if we're going to be partners, we should probably learn to have conversations that aren't about factory safety or political survival." "Do we know how to do that?" "No idea, but it might be interesting to find out." The carriage rolled through Mayfair toward whatever passed for celebration in lives too complicated for simple victories. Elena watched the city and thought about everything that had changed in 3 weeks, from accusation to alliance, from isolation to partnership, from principles held alone to work shared with someone who understood costs too painful to name. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, wasn't safe or simple or anything her younger self would have recognized as success. But it was real, earned, built from decisions neither of them could take back and consequences they'd face together. And for the first time since her parents died, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten, the possibility that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. That maybe, in this strange collaboration between broken people trying to fix a broken system, something more than survival might actually be possible. She didn't name it yet, didn't let herself examine it too closely. But as Adrian spoke about restaurants and public visibility and strategic dinner conversation, she felt it there beneath the practical planning. A warmth that had nothing to do with factory reforms or political victories, something fragile and probably dangerous and absolutely impossible to ignore. Catherine would say she was being foolish. The opposition would call it scandalous. Adrian himself would probably dismiss it as strategic sentiment at best. But Elena had spent 2 years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and she'd learned something essential. The most important work happened in spaces between impossible and necessary, where logic failed and stubbornness survived. She'd built a partnership there. Maybe, eventually, carefully, against all reasonable odds, she could build something else too. The restaurant was exactly as Adrian promised, expensive enough that scandal hesitated at the door, respectable enough that their presence registered as statement rather than provocation. They sat near the windows where anyone passing could see them, deliberate visibility that dared London to look and judge and find their partnership exactly what they claimed: professional, purposeful, unashamed. Elena barely tasted the food. Her mind kept circling back to Lord Ashford's request, trying to calculate what it meant that the opposition was fracturing. "You're not eating," Adrian observed. "I'm thinking." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." But he set down his own fork. "What's troubling you?" "Nothing troubles me. I'm just processing." She met his eyes across candlelight that made the angles of his face softer than daylight allowed. "3 weeks ago I accused you in a ballroom. Today a lord who wanted me destroyed is hiring me to inspect his factories. That's not normal progression. No, it's evidence that truth outlasts scandal when you refuse to let scandal define the narrative." Adrian's voice carried satisfaction he rarely showed. "You did that, not me. Your report was fair enough that even opponents had to acknowledge its credibility." "We did it. The partnership." "Yes." He said it quietly, like the word carried weight beyond definition. "The partnership." Something in his tone made Elena look closer. Beneath the controlled exterior, she saw exhaustion he'd been hiding for days. Shadows under his eyes, tension in shoulders that never quite relaxed. The shareholders' meeting had cost him more than he'd admitted. "How bad were the promises you had to make?" she asked. "Manageable. Mostly commitments to maintain profitability benchmarks while implementing reforms. They want proof changes don't destroy the business model." He picked up his wine, studied it without drinking. "I have 18 months to demonstrate that better conditions and sustainable profits can coexist. If I fail, the board can force divestment. They're betting you'll fail." "Of course. They need me to fail so they can justify maintaining exploitation in their own operations." He finally drank. "That's why Ashford's request matters. If other owners start seeing reform as competitive advantage rather than moral burden, the entire calculation shifts." Elena understood then. This wasn't just about surviving the shareholders' meeting. It was about changing the game itself, making worker protection profitable enough that greed drove adoption better than conscience ever could. It was brilliant and cynical, and exactly the kind of thinking that made Adrian dangerous in ways his enemies kept underestimating. "You've been planning this from the beginning," she said. "The whole strategy, using me as proof that reform works, then letting that proof spread through the industry. Not using you, working with you toward aligned goals." But something in his expression admitted the accuracy of her assessment. "I won't apologize for strategic thinking, but I also won't pretend the strategy is all that matters." "What else matters?" He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "You do. Your work, your safety, your—" He stopped, choosing words carefully. "Your presence in this has become more than strategic convenience. It's become necessary in ways I didn't anticipate and probably shouldn't acknowledge." The admission hung between them, too honest for the public restaurant, too important to dismiss. Elena felt her heart accelerate. "Adrian, I know it's inappropriate timing and complicated circumstances, and Catherine would probably tell you to run." He set down his glass with controlled precision. "But I've spent 3 years pretending emotions don't exist because acknowledging them meant facing how thoroughly I failed the last person who trusted me. And I'm tired of pretending, tired of calculating everything and feeling nothing. You make me feel things again. Inconvenient, complicated things that interfere with strategic planning. What kind of things?" "Curiosity about what you're thinking. Anger when people attack you. Satisfaction when you succeed." He paused. "Fear that I'll fail you the way I failed Elizabeth. That my protection will prove as insufficient as every other promise I've made." Elena reached across the table, surprising herself by taking his hand. His fingers tensed, then relaxed into hers. "You're not failing me. You're fighting an entire system alongside me. That's not the same as emotional neglect of a spouse you weren't present for. Isn't it? I'm still using work as armor against actual intimacy. Still calculating outcomes instead of acknowledging feelings. Still," his voice caught, "still terrified that caring about someone means I'll destroy them through insufficient attention. Then pay attention. Elena said it firmly. Not perfectly. I don't need perfect, just honestly. When work matters more than conversation, say so. When you need distance, take it. But don't hide behind strategy and pretend we're only colleagues when we both know it's become something else. What has it become? I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out, if you're brave enough to risk it. Adrian laughed quietly, without humor. I've survived a shareholders' coup and public scandal, but the idea of actual emotional vulnerability terrifies me more than both combined. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. Elena used his own words back at him. I'm not asking for declarations or promises, just honesty about what this is becoming. Can you do that? I can try. He turned his hand in hers, properly holding it now. Fair warning, I'm terrible at this. Elizabeth used to say talking to me about feelings was like negotiating with a particularly stubborn contract, and she wasn't wrong. I've negotiated with factory owners and aristocrats who wanted me destroyed. I think I can handle your emotional unavailability. That's either confidence or delusion. Probably both. Elena smiled despite the seriousness. We match that way. They finished dinner in quieter conversation, talking about everything except the work that usually consumed them. Adrian told her about growing up with expectations that crushed spontaneity, about learning to calculate emotions as young as 8 because feelings were inefficient. Elena shared her parents' academic poverty, the way they'd valued ideas over social position and died leaving her nothing but books and principles. It wasn't romance, not the sweeping kind novels promised or society expected, just two damaged people finding unlikely recognition in each other's particular forms of broken. But walking back to the carriage, Adrian's hand steadied her elbow with care that felt like more than courtesy. And when he helped her inside, his fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. Small things, insufficient things, but honest. They could build from that. Maybe. The next 3 months proved harder than either expected. Lord Ashford's factories were nightmares, worse than anything Elena had documented before. She spent weeks in Birmingham cataloging violations, interviewing workers too afraid to speak loudly, documenting conditions that made Manchester's old operations look humane. Her report was brutal and specific and utterly fair. Ashford published it himself, alongside a commitment to implement every recommended reform within 2 years. The industry reacted like he'd committed treason. 12 factory owners signed a joint statement condemning his surrender to radical sentiment. The newspapers called him weak. His fellow lords questioned his business acumen at clubs he'd belonged to for decades. But workers read the report in penny papers and saw someone with power actually listening. 3 other owners quietly contacted Elena through Adrian's secretary, requesting similar assessments. Not because they cared about morality, because they feared losing labor to competitors treating workers better. The calculation was shifting, slowly, incompletely, but undeniably. Adrian's parliamentary proposal was still pending, caught in committees that moved like glaciers. But each new factory assessment, each published report showing reforms worked, built pressure that even Parliament couldn't ignore forever. Elena moved from Adrian's guest quarters into a small house he owned in Bloomsbury. Respectable distance, proper separation, enough independence that society couldn't quite call it scandal. Catherine visited weekly, still suspicious, but gradually accepting that maybe this partnership was exactly what it claimed. "You're happy," she said one afternoon, watching Elena organize inspection notes. "It's unsettling. I'm busy. That's different." "You're busy and happy. I've known you 10 years. This is new." Catherine studied her face. "It's him, isn't it? Not just the work. Him specifically." Elena didn't answer immediately. She'd been asking herself the same question for weeks, trying to separate professional respect from something more complicated. "He listens," she said finally. "When I talk about reforms or worker conditions or problems I've found, he actually listens, asks questions that matter, implements suggestions even when they're expensive or difficult. That's intoxicating for someone used to being dismissed," Catherine finished. "I know. I just worry you're mistaking professional validation for emotional connection." "Maybe I am, but maybe they're not as separate as you think." Elena set down her pen. "He's not perfect. He's emotionally distant and obsessed with work, and still grieving someone I'll never replace. But he's trying. Actually trying to be present instead of just efficient. That matters. It matters until it doesn't. Until work becomes more important again and you're left wondering why you weren't enough. I don't need to be enough. I need to be recognized. Elena met her friend's eyes. There's a difference. Elizabeth needed him to be emotionally available in ways he couldn't be. I just need him to acknowledge what we're building together. He's capable of that. Catherine sighed. I hope you're right, because if this goes wrong, you don't have safety nets anymore. You've tied everything to him. Work, reputation, housing, future prospects. All of it. I know. And you're all right with that? Elena thought about it honestly. The risk was enormous. If Adrian withdrew support or their partnership fractured, she'd be left with nothing. No employment, no credibility, no path forward. But she'd been living with nothing when this started. At least now she had purpose and work that mattered and someone who valued her contributions enough to fight for them. I'm all right with it, she said. The letter came in November, 6 months after the shareholders' meeting. Heavy paper, official seal, delivered by messenger who waited for response. Elena broke the seal and read, Miss Vieramont, the Parliamentary Committee on Industrial Reform requests your testimony regarding factory conditions and proposed safety legislation. Your appearance is scheduled for December 3rd at 2 o'clock. Failure to attend may result in subpoena. Lord Chancellor Pemberton. Her hand shook reading it. This was the culmination, Parliament itself asking her to speak, to present everything she'd documented in front of lords who could actually change laws. It was also a trap. The committee was stacked with factory owners and their allies. They'd invited her to testify so they could discredit her publicly, destroy her credibility before Adrian's proposal came to vote. She needed to tell him immediately. Elena found Adrian in his study, buried in paperwork as always. He looked up when she entered, saw her expression, and set down his pen. What happened? She handed him the letter. He read it in silence, face showing nothing. Then he set it down carefully. They're going to eviscerate you. I know. Publicly, in front of the entire committee. They'll question your credentials, your motives, your relationship with me. They'll try to make you look incompetent or corrupt, or both. Adrian's voice stayed level, but his hands clenched. This is my fault. I should have testified myself, kept you out of... No. Elena cut him off. They want me specifically because I'm vulnerable. A woman with questionable reputation testifying about factory conditions, she has no formal authority to judge. It plays into every bias they hold. Exactly. Which is why you shouldn't go. Which is exactly why I have to. She sat down across from him. If I refuse, they win. They get to say I was too afraid to defend my work under scrutiny. But if I go, if I present evidence clearly and handle their attacks without breaking, I prove the work stands regardless of who did it. They'll destroy you anyway. Not because you fail, because you threaten their profits. Adrian stood, pacing with the agitation he usually controlled better. I can't protect you in that room. Parliamentary privilege means I can't even respond to their attacks. You'll be alone against men who've spent decades perfecting political cruelty. Then I'll be alone. I've been alone before. Not like this. He stopped in front of her, and Elena saw fear in his eyes she'd never seen before. This isn't social exclusion or anonymous threats. This is systematic demolition of your credibility and character in a public forum that will be reported in every newspaper in England. If you survive it intact, you'll be the first person I've ever seen do so. Do you think I can't handle it? I think you're brilliant and brave and completely unprepared for how viciously they'll attack when cornered. His voice softened. I think you'll walk in there with facts and principles, an honest belief that truth matters. And they'll use all of that against you because they know exactly how to twist sincerity into evidence of naivety. Elena stood, meeting his eyes. Then teach me. You survived shareholders' meetings with men trying to destroy you. You know how to navigate political cruelty. Help me prepare. Elena, please, don't protect me from this. Prepare me for it. She took his hands, feeling them tremble slightly. You said you were tired of calculating everything and feeling nothing. Prove it. Feel this fear you have for me and then help me anyway. Trust that I'm strong enough to survive what's coming. Adrian looked at their joined hands, then at her face. Something resolved in his expression. All right, but we do this properly. Every attack they might launch, we prepare a response. Every weakness in your testimony, we shore it up. And we practice until you can handle their worst without breaking. How long do we have? 3 weeks. He pulled her toward his desk, already shifting into the strategic mode she knew so well. We'll need every day. The next 3 weeks consumed them both. Adrian became ruthless in preparation, attacking her testimony from every angle, forcing her to defend positions until she could do it reflexively. He brought in colleagues to play hostile questioners, hired lawyers to identify weaknesses, drilled her on parliamentary procedure until she dreamed about it. It was exhausting, brutal, exactly what she needed. Catherine attended some sessions, watching with worried eyes as Adrian tore apart Elena's arguments and forced her to rebuild them stronger. Afterward, she pulled Elena aside. "He's terrified," Catherine said quietly. "I know. Not just professionally, personally. He's afraid of losing you." She paused. "I think he might actually love you, in his broken, calculating way." Elena didn't answer. She'd been feeling it too. The way Adrian's preparation crossed from professional into protective. The way he couldn't quite hide fear when she stumbled in practice sessions. But love required acknowledgement neither of them had offered. "It doesn't matter right now," she said. "Right now, I just need to survive testimony." December 3rd arrived too quickly. Elena dressed in her most severe outfit, dark colors, high collar, nothing that could be called frivolous. Adrian's carriage waited outside to take her to Parliament. He'd wanted to accompany her, but his presence would only confirm the opposition's narrative. So she went alone, Catherine beside her for moral support that couldn't extend into the committee room itself. "Remember," Catherine said as they approached Parliament, "they want you angry or tearful or defensive. Don't give them any of it. Just facts." "Just facts," Elena repeated. Her heart hammered against ribs that felt too tight. The committee room was smaller than expected, which somehow made it worse. 15 men sat in a semicircle, looking down at a single chair positioned for testimony. No desk, no barrier. Just her and them, and 3 weeks of preparation that suddenly felt completely insufficient. Lord Chancellor Pemberton presided, his face already showing the disdain he'd perfected over decades in power. To his right sat the Duchess of Pembroke's husband. To his left, 2 factory owners Elena recognized from her reports. They'd stacked the deck completely. "Miss Viremont," Pemberton's voice carried false courtesy. "Thank you for appearing. We have questions about your work as factory consultant." Elena sat in the chair they'd positioned for maximum vulnerability. "I'm prepared to answer them." "Excellent. Let's begin with your credentials. What formal training do you possess in industrial management or engineering?" "None." "None." He repeated it for emphasis. "Yet you presume to advise factory owners on operational efficiency?" "I advise on worker safety and legal compliance. Neither requires engineering expertise. They require documentation of conditions and comparison against existing regulations." "Documented how? Through what methodology?" "Direct observation, worker interviews, examination of safety equipment and operational procedures. Standard investigative journalism practices applied to industrial settings." "Journalism." Another committee member, Lord Fairfax, leaned forward. "So you're a reporter, writing sensational stories to sell papers?" "I publish factual reports with documented evidence. Whether that qualifies as journalism or consultation depends on your definitions. Well, our definitions suggest you're an unqualified woman with reformist agenda attacking legitimate businesses." Elena felt anger rise and suppressed it. Adrian had warned her about this exact tactic. "My gender and qualifications are less relevant than the accuracy of my findings. If you'd like to dispute any specific claims in my published reports, I can provide supporting documentation. We're disputing your authority to make claims at all. Then dispute the facts themselves. Tell me which children I invented, which injuries I falsified, which safety violations I manufactured." She kept her voice level. "My reports list names, dates, specific incidents. If they're inaccurate, prove it." Pemberton's eyes narrowed. Miss Weiermont, your relationship with the Duke of Blackthorn is well documented. How much of your work is actually his agenda disguised as independent assessment? There it was. The attack she'd prepared for most carefully. The Duke hired me after I publicly accused him of exploitation. That's documented in newspaper accounts you can verify. My first report on his facilities identified remaining problems alongside implemented improvements. He published it anyway, without edits. If I were simply promoting his agenda, that makes no strategic sense. Unless you're both promoting the same radical reforms. Factory safety isn't radical, it's baseline humanity. If treating children like human beings rather than machinery sounds radical to you, that says more about your standards than mine. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably. Elena saw it and pressed. Every reform I've recommended is already legal requirement. I'm not proposing new laws. I'm documenting violations of existing ones. If enforcing current regulations sounds radical, perhaps you should examine why you find legal compliance so threatening. You overstep, Miss Weiermont. I state facts. If facts overstep, perhaps the boundaries need examination. The questioning continued for 2 hours. They attacked her credibility, her methods, her relationship with Adrian, her financial arrangements, everything. Elena answered each attack with documented facts and careful phrasing Adrian had drilled into her. She didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't break. Finally, Pemberton called recess. Elena stood on shaking legs and walked out with her spine straight and expression controlled. Catherine met her in the hallway, pulling her into an empty room. You're brilliant, absolutely brilliant. They tried everything and you didn't give them anything. Catherine was almost laughing with relief. Did you see Pemberton's face when you challenged their definition of radical? He looked like he'd swallowed glass. Elena couldn't respond. The adrenaline that had carried her through testimony was draining, leaving exhaustion so profound she could barely stand. She'd survived. But they weren't done yet. The afternoon session was worse. They brought in factory owners to testify about how Elena's recommendations would bankrupt their operations. Each one painted her as a dangerous idealist who didn't understand business realities. Elena sat and listened and waited for her chance to respond. When Pemberton finally allowed it, she stood. Everything these gentlemen said might be true, if we accept that worker safety and business success are incompatible. But I've documented facilities proving otherwise. The Duke of Blackthorn's Manchester operations implemented every reform I recommended. Productivity is up 18%. Worker injuries are down 62%. Voluntary turnover has dropped by half. These aren't theoretical projections. They're measured outcomes over 18 months. The Duke is an outlier. Lord Ashford's Birmingham facilities are implementing the same reforms. Early results show similar trends. Factory owners in Leeds, Sheffield, and Glasgow have requested assessments. If these reforms only work for outliers, why are so many requesting them? She looked at each committee member. The truth is, worker safety and profitability aren't opposed. They're aligned. Healthy workers are productive workers. Safe facilities reduce costly accidents. Reasonable hours prevent expensive mistakes. Everything I recommend makes business sense, if you're willing to accept slightly lower profit margins in exchange for sustainable operations. Slightly lower margins destroy competitive advantage. Then compete on quality instead of exploitation. Innovate instead of cutting corners. Build businesses that don't require children's mangled hands to function. Elena's voice rose despite her intention to stay level. You keep talking about business realities. Here's reality. Those children grow into adults who remember which owners treated them as disposable. Those workers have children who will choose where to work. The future you're protecting through exploitation is the past, and it's dying whether you acknowledge it or not. The room went absolutely silent. Pemberton's face had gone purple. Miss Weiermont, you forget your place. My place is documenting truth. Your place is deciding whether truth matters more than protecting profits built on suffering. I've stated my findings. You can accept them or dismiss them, but you can't claim ignorance anymore. The evidence exists. What you do with it defines you. She sat down, heart pounding so hard she thought it might be audible. The committee deliberated for 20 minutes, then recalled her. Miss Weiermont, Pemberton said stiffly. This committee finds your testimony provocative. We'll take your findings under advisement when considering the Duke of Blackthorn's proposal. It was an endorsement, but it wasn't dismissal either. Elena nodded and walked out with whatever dignity she had left. Catherine was waiting with a carriage. We're going to Adrian's. He's been pacing his study since you left. I think he wore a groove in the floor. Elena laughed shakily. I survived. You did more than survive. You fought them to a draw, which for a woman with no formal credentials facing the industrial lobby is basically victory. The carriage took them to Mayfair. Adrian met them at the door, his face showing strain he hadn't bothered hiding. Well? He asked. They didn't destroy me. They tried, but I held. Something released in his expression. He pulled her inside, propriety forgotten, and just held her while she shook with delayed reaction. You were magnificent, he said into her hair. Daniel was there taking notes. He said you gave the best testimony he's seen in 30 years of parliamentary observation. I said too much at the end, lost my temper. You spoke truth. That's not losing temper. That's refusing to let them control the narrative. Adrian pulled back enough to see her face. They'll vote on my proposal next week. Your testimony will influence that vote, probably positively, given how you handled their attacks. Elena didn't care about the vote right then. She was too exhausted, too wrung out from holding herself together for 5 hours of sustained assault. I need to sleep for approximately a week. You've earned it. But Adrian didn't let her go. Elena, before you rest, I need to say something I should have said months ago. She looked up at him, seeing fear and determination fighting in his expression. I'm in love with you, and he said quietly. Not strategically or conveniently or as calculated emotional investment. Actually in love, in ways that terrify me because every time I care about someone I find new ways to fail them. But I'm done pretending otherwise, done calculating feelings like they're business decisions. You make me want to be present instead of distant, human instead of efficient. And I don't know how to do that properly, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me. Elena's breath caught. She'd known it was coming to this, had felt it building for months. But hearing him say it, actually admit to feelings he'd been denying since Elizabeth died, made it real in ways she hadn't prepared for. I love you too, Mason, she said. Even though you're emotionally unavailable and obsessed with work and terrible at vulnerability, even though this probably ends badly because we're both too damaged to know how to do this right, I still love you. That's not a very romantic declaration. It's an honest one. She smiled despite exhaustion. We're not a romance novel, Adrian. We're two broken people who found each other in the middle of fighting a system designed to crush us both. That's messier than romance, but it's real. He kissed her then, careful and tentative like he'd forgotten how. Elena kissed him back with equal uncertainty, both of them fumbling toward something that felt more like recognition than passion. It wasn't perfect, wasn't sweeping or dramatic or anything society would approve, but it was theirs, earned through survival and partnership and refusing to let fear stop them from trying. Catherine cleared her throat from the doorway. I hate to interrupt whatever this is, but the reporters are gathering outside. Apparently word of Elena's testimony spread quickly. Adrian sighed but didn't let go of Elena. We should make a statement. Together? Together. Let them see the partnership, all of it. They walked out onto Adrian's front steps to face 24 reporters and growing crowd. Questions erupted immediately, about testimony, about the proposal, about their relationship. Adrian held up his hand and the crowd quieted. Miss Viremont testified before Parliament today with courage and clarity. Her work documenting factory conditions has been exemplary. I'm honored to call her my colleague and partner. He paused deliberately. And yes, before you ask, partner in both professional and personal capacities. Any questions about impropriety can address themselves to the fact that we're both adults capable of making our own choices. The crowd erupted. Elena felt panic rise. This was more public than they'd planned, more definitive than society would easily forgive. Then Adrian took her hand, visible to everyone, and she understood. This was the line, the point past which there was no retreat into strategic distance or professional separation. They were claiming this partnership publicly, completely, consequences and all. Miss Viremont, a reporter shouted. Does this mean? It means exactly what his grace said. We're partners. In work that matters and life that follows from it. Elena's voice stayed steady. Anyone who has problems with that arrangement is welcome to discuss it after examining our published findings on worker safety. Otherwise, we consider the subject addressed. Adrian smiled slightly. What she said. They went back inside, leaving the reporters to their speculation. Catherine was shaking her head. You two are either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I genuinely can't tell which. Both, Elena and Adrian said simultaneously. Parliament voted the following week. Adrian's proposal passed by a margin of 12 votes, narrow enough to be uncertain, wide enough to matter. Factory safety standards became law. Mandatory education provisions for child workers became enforceable. Independent inspections became required. It wasn't everything. Enforcement would be difficult. Opposition would continue. But it was real change, written into law, backed by evidence Elena had documented and testimony she'd survived to deliver. 6 months later, Elena published a comprehensive report showing implementation across 50 factories. Worker injuries had dropped 48% industry-wide. Child labor under age 10 had been eliminated in compliant facilities. Wages had actually increased as productivity improved under safer conditions. The market had shifted. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably. Factory owners who'd fought the reforms now competed to hire Elena for assessments, understanding that good safety records attracted better workers and improved reputation. What began as moral argument had become economic advantage. Catherine visited Elena's office, actual office now, funded by consultation fees that let her hire 2 assistants, and looked around with something like wonder. You did it. Actually did it. We did it. All of us. Elena gestured at the reports covering every surface. Adrian's proposal gave it teeth. Your support gave me courage. The workers who trusted me with their stories gave it truth. This wasn't one person. It was collaboration. Still, 3 years ago you had nothing but principles and a tendency towards social suicide. Now you're the most sought-after factory consultant in England. You've changed actual laws, and you're living with a duke who looks at you like you hung the stars. Catherine smiled. It's nauseating and wonderful. I don't live with him. I have my own residence. You spend 4 nights a week at his Mayfair house, and he spends 3 at your Bloomsbury office. That's cohabitation with extra steps. Elena couldn't argue. She and Adrian had given up pretending their relationship was purely professional months ago. Society had opinions, loud, varied, mostly scandalized, but enough respected voices had defended them that the scandal had settled into simple fact. The Duke and his consultant. Unusual, certainly, but productive enough that opposition was harder to maintain. Are you happy? Catherine asked. Elena thought about it honestly. Happy felt too simple for what she had. Partnership with someone who understood her completely. Work that mattered. Visible impact on problems that used to feel insurmountable. But underneath all that was something quieter. Satisfaction. Purpose. The deep contentment of building something real with someone who valued her contributions as much as her presence. Yes, she said. I think I actually am. That evening, she returned to Adrian's Mayfair residence. Her residence too, really, though they maintained the fiction of separation. He met her in the study where this had all started, looking up from paperwork with the slight smile he reserved for her alone. Lord Ashford's Birmingham facilities passed final inspection today. Full compliance, all standards exceeded. He'll want to publicize that. Already writing the press release. Adrian set down his pen, pulling her into his lap with casual intimacy that still surprised her sometimes. I received an interesting letter today from the Royal Society. They're creating a new fellowship in industrial reform. They want to offer it to you. Elena's breath caught. The Royal Society doesn't offer fellowships to women. They're making an exception. Apparently, documentation and testimony that changes parliamentary law qualifies as significant contribution to the field. He handed her the letter. You'd be the first woman fellow in their 100-year history. She read it in silence, tears blurring the formal language. This was recognition beyond anything she'd imagined. Institutional acknowledgement that her work mattered, that gender was less important than contribution. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Accept it. Let them honor work that deserves honoring. Adrian's voice was soft. You've changed an industry through documentation and stubborn refusal to accept that exploitation was inevitable. That's fellowship worthy. We changed it. Together. No. He turned her to face him. I implemented reforms I should have made years earlier. You documented why they mattered and fought to spread them when everyone said it was impossible. That's your achievement. Own it. Elena kissed him, pouring 3 years of gratitude and love and partnership into contact that still felt new every time. When they broke apart, she saw the expression she'd learned to recognize. Adrian present, actually present, not calculating or distant, but genuinely here with her. I love you, she said, for all your emotional unavailability and workaholic tendencies and complete inability to express feelings normally. I love you too, for your stubborn principles and tendency toward social suicide and absolute refusal to let anyone tell you what's impossible. They sat together in comfortable silence, Elena reading the fellowship letter again, Adrian returning to paperwork that would help more workers somewhere. Outside, London carried on with all its usual chaos. Inside, two people who'd found each other through conflict built something that looked like peace. Not perfect peace, not uncomplicated or easy or anything romance novels promised, but real. Earned, theirs. Elena thought about that ballroom 3 years ago, when she'd walked in prepared to fight and found something more complicated than enemy or ally. She thought about Manchester factories and parliamentary testimony and 3 weeks of brutal preparation that taught her she was stronger than fear. She thought about all the moments between, the decision to stay when running was safer, the choice to build partnership instead of seeking rescue, the gradual understanding that love was work too, requiring presence and honesty and willingness to fail better each time. And she thought about the letter in her hands, offering recognition she'd never sought but absolutely earned. I'll accept it, she told Adrian. The fellowship. Good. On one condition. He looked up, amused. You're negotiating with the Royal Society? I'm negotiating with you. I'll accept the fellowship if you agree to actually take a holiday. 2 weeks, minimum, away from work in London and factory reports. That's blackmail. That's partnership. I achieve public recognition. You achieve work-life balance. We both benefit. She smiled. Unless you're afraid of spending 2 weeks focused on personal relationship instead of business agenda? Terrified, actually. But Adrian was smiling too. All right, 2 weeks, somewhere without factories or parliamentary committees or anything requiring strategic planning. Scotland. Too rainy. France. Deal. They shook hands with mock formality, then dissolved into laughter that felt like light after years of fighting in darkness. And later, when Elena wrote her acceptance letter to the Royal Society, she included a note at the bottom. This recognition belongs as much to the workers who trusted me with their stories as to me personally. I accept it in honor of their courage and in service to the work that remains unfinished. Factory reform is not complete. It's begun. And I intend to continue it for as long as strength and opportunity allow. She showed it to Adrian before sending. He read it and nodded. Perfect. Gracious without being diminishing. Accurate without being political. He paused. They'll use it in publicity. The Royal Society enjoys exceptional narratives. Let them. If it helps spread understanding that worker safety matters, they can publish whatever they want. That's my stubborn reformer. Adrian pulled her close again, and Elena felt the familiar warmth of being known completely. 3 years ago, you accused me in a ballroom. Now you're a Royal Society fellow changing industrial law. That's remarkable progression. 3 years ago, you were a widower using work to avoid grief. Now you're a reformer who occasionally acknowledges emotions exist. That's remarkable too. We've both changed. We've both grown, together. Elena rested her head against his shoulder. I like who we're becoming. Even though it's messy and complicated and probably slightly inappropriate by society's standards, especially because of that. Perfect things are traps. Messy things are real. They sat together as evening darkened into night, planning France and fellowship ceremonies and the next round of factory inspections that would take them into spring. Two broken people who'd found each other in the middle of impossible work, building partnership that survived because they chose it daily, consciously, with full knowledge of costs and complications. It wasn't the ending Elena had imagined when she walked into that ballroom 3 years ago. It was better, more real, more earned, more honest about both triumphs and remaining struggles. The work wasn't finished. Exploitation still existed. Laws weren't perfectly enforced. Change came slower than principle demanded. But it came. Measurably, documentably, undeniably. And Elena Weiermont, Royal Society Fellow and factory reform consultant, would be there to push it forward, with Adrian beside her, workers' trust behind her, and stubborn conviction that wouldn't bend regardless of opposition ahead. She'd spoken truth to power in a room designed to silence her, and somehow, impossibly, power had started listening. That was victory worth celebrating, worth building from, worth dedicating a life to messily and imperfectly and with absolute commitment. Together, they'd changed a system that seemed unchangeable. Together, they'd continue changing it, one factory at a time, one partnership decision at a time, one honest acknowledgement of love and work and complicated humanity at a time. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered.